Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Anna Greenberg, and I'm the Wetland Program Manager with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. I'm based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm going to give a couple quick intro slides and then ask our other facilitators to introduce themselves before we hop into content. So let me do that here. Alrighty, so here's our rough agenda. We've got breaks, we've got an hour for lunch, and we've added time at the end of each session for questions and discussion, and sharing expertise as well. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So it's just some logistics. We are recording this session. I'm going to send the recording out to everybody who RSVP'd, and then you're welcome to send it out to anybody else. So if you have colleagues or a staff or anything like that who might benefit from this recording, feel free to send it out to them. But I will start with our RSVP email list. As I said, we have got time for questions after each session. And we have a lot of various expertise and experience on the workshop today. And so, you know, at the end of sessions, if you have something to add or you have experience on one of the topics that we're discussing, please feel free to voice that and contribute. I mean, the goal of this workshop is to get folks familiar with and comfortable with talking about playas. So anything that you can contribute to that conversation is welcome. Please add questions to the chat, use the raise your hand function. We'll try to, you know, go through the session slides that our facilitators have put together, but then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion after each session. I want to give a huge thank you to our facilitators today. We've got folks from NRCS, from Playa Lakes Joint Venture, and from Ducks Unlimited who are helping with this workshop today. So I'd ask my facilitators to just turn your cameras on real quick and give a quick hello. You're welcome to go in order on the slide here if that's helpful.
That is helpful. This is Christopher Rustay. I'm a Conservation Delivery Manager with the Playa Lakes Joint Venture. I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but have been working across the region for the last 20 years.
Hi, I'm Katie Merriweather. I'm the Colorado NRCS state biologist, and I'm here to talk about landowners today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Patty Knapp. I'm the NRCS area wildlife biologist for southeastern Colorado, and I will be talking about playa restoration.
Good morning. My name is Dominic Pinalto. I work for the NRCS in Hays, Kansas. I'm an easement specialist, and I will be talking about playa restoration as well today with cropland playas.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Andy Steinert. I'm a soil scientist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service out here in Fort Morgan, Colorado. I'll be one of the folks talking about playa soils today.
Hi, I'm Mary Ellen Cannon, and I'm the resource soil scientist for Area 2, which is northeastern Colorado, where there are a lot of playas. Andy put together the PowerPoint, and he's probably going to do really the presentation. I'm happy to help people with things like texture and things like that will help you identify playas.
I'm Abe Lawler. I'm a Ducks Unlimited biologist based out of Kansas, and I'm going to kind of talk about why Kansas has had success in Playa Lake conservation, and hopefully take what we learned today and implement it in Colorado.
Thank you, everybody. I can't emphasize enough how appreciative I am, and hopefully the attendees are, of these facilitators and all the work they've put into the presentations. I am not a playas expert, so I'm going to be learning just as much as the attendees today from our facilitators, so I'm really thankful to have them. Wanted to give you guys a quick overview. We don't have time to do intros of everybody on the call, even though that would be great. So I wanted to show you sort of, you know, you all, when you RSVP'd, answered some survey questions. So who's here on this call today? So we have a lot of attendees from the NRCS, a lot of folks from Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and then a variety of other state and nonprofit entities from varying states. So we have a good mix of folks on the call. Most of our attendees today are from Colorado, but we've got a good number of people from Nebraska. And then we have a couple people who noted that they work across multiple states. Majority of our attendees work directly with private landowners. So that's why, we really want to spend some time after the lunch break, talking about working with landowners on playas, how to have those discussions, how to make playa conservation something that's compelling for landowners who might not know or might not think of them as a landscape feature as a benefit. And then lastly, the vast majority of our attendees today have some familiarity with playas. And then we have a couple people, I would throw myself in this one, of pretty new to the world of playas and restoration. And then we have some experts in here as well. So as I say, during these discussions and question sessions, please feel free to share your expertise and experience so that everybody can learn from each other. With that, I am going to stop and I'm going to turn it over to Christopher to get us started. Christopher, do you want to share your screen or do you want me to drive your slides? I'm happy either way.
I'll share my screen.
Okay, I'm going to stop. And I will be kind of working as facilitator today. So if there's questions in the chat or there are hands raised or things like that, I will make sure that we get to those questions and things. So all you, Christopher.
Great. Y'all can see the slides.
Yes, we can.
Yep. Perfect. Okay. I'm starting a timer just so I don't go over. I can talk a lot, so I'm trying not to do that.
I'll keep you on track, Christopher.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about basics of playas, understanding what they are, what they are, how they form, just a little bit, and then what is a healthy playa in this first talk, and we'll get right into it. So playas are in unique watersheds. So the watershed is unique to the playa. Water does not go in or out of that watershed. It just goes down to the lowest point, which is where the ponding begins for a playa. They are temporary or ephemeral. They don't last forever. They should not last forever, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in the talk. They collect rainwater primarily and runoff from the large watersheds that has no inflow, outflow. We talked about that. When they're healthy, they're surrounded by grass buffers or just native grasslands. And most importantly, I think for this talk, they're mostly found on private lands rather than on public lands. Just a few terms to get you used to understanding a little bit about playas and the terminology used. I'll introduce some other terms in the rest of the presentation, but these will help you for now. Playas are this area here. I think you all can see my cursor sort of defined. Whoops, that was not supposed to happen. The area that is defined by my cursor is the playa itself. On the outside of the of the playa basin itself, which you'll find what's called the annulus. No, I don't use the term very much, but it is important, a little bit important to understand a little bit about recharge. Between playas, where we often find cropland or can find cropland in very flat areas, is the interplaya area. Sometimes there are channels or waterways that lead into playa basins themselves, and you can see this one here sort of barely. And then this other term, lunette, I want to emphasize, is often what creates a slight hill on the leeward side of the playa. When playas are dry, wind blows through them, blows out sediment that may have come down into the bottom of the playa basin and piles it up on the leeward side. So you often get these little hills that are shaped like 1/4 moons, and thus the name lunette. Playas go through a wet-dry cycle. They are ephemeral. They can be dry for as many as 9 or more years, but on average, they are wet just 1 in 10 years across the entire region, which goes from Nebraska down to Texas, where playas are found. during when folks see them, it's dry. They often don't understand that they are lakes. But when they see the picture on the right or something that looks like the picture on the right, they get the idea. Folks often think, especially if they're on private lands, that they want to have water in them all the time. It certainly would be more helpful for cattle operations, but that is not the way they work the best. They actually depend on the wet-dry cycle, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. The reason they need to, the reason that they work and have a wet-dry cycle is because the clay that's on the bottom of the basin dries during those dry cycles. When clay dries, it shrinks. And so you get these large holes or cracks developing in the Playa Basin. When you get a big storm coming through, it dumps a bunch of water fairly quickly onto the landscape and flows down and starts into the Playa Basin itself. Before it starts ponding, you find water going through those cracks, through the clay basin, and down to the soil below. And it starts infiltrating towards the Ogallala Aquifer. It's recharge. It's a big message, and this is one of the big messages that the Playa Lakes Joint Venture has found resonates with a lot of private landowners. Once the clay gets wet enough, which takes approximately an hour, it will start to swell up again, and you'll get, that's when you start getting ponding. So the amount of water that you see on the landscape when a playa has started to pond and the clay has swelled up and closed off those cracks is about only 10% of the water that actually falls into the Playa Basin. Most of the water, about 90%, falls into the watershed, goes down through those cracks before and within an hour before you start seeing any of that ponding. So here's just a diagram of that. I want to point to you to the picture that's in the left-hand corner there. This is a picture of a macropore or a crack. I rarely use the term macropore, but it's a fun one and it's good for this conversation. There's some farmer in Kansas. Now, Abe, I'm sorry, guys in Kansas. I would never go out in the middle of a rainstorm to take a picture of this, but somebody in Kansas did. And I'm very happy they did, because it really shows the water pouring down into those cracks. Once the clay layer has swollen up and closed off those primary fissures in the clay basin, you still get a little bit of recharge happening along plant roots that go through the clay. And then the rest of any additional recharge, maybe about 3 to 4%, continues happening along the annulus or the sides of the playa. Along the playa edge. So this is just a term, something that to let you know what is happening with a healthy playa. It has an intact basin and intact watershed as well. There's no excess sediment. And I should point out here that sediment in the playa bottom is always expected. A little bit of sediment is always expected there, but when you get too much, it can be an issue. Wind will come through when the playa is dry and blow it out, thus keeping the playa quote unquote clean. There shouldn't be any modifications to the basin itself. Pits, sometimes people trench them to concentrate water in certain areas. Roads go through them. There can be other types of modifications, but a healthy playa has none of those. Very important, you need to have a grass surrounding the playa itself to trap sediment, but it allows water to go into the playa basin. If you don't have that grass buffer, anything else that you do to restore a playa is pointless, because you're wasting your money. Yeah, you're going to get a lot of sediment continuing to go into the playa basin, and that's not what you want. It won't function naturally. And then finally, it has to go through these wet and dry cycles. So I talked a little bit about the water coming in, going into the cracks, but this is really sort of how playas have formed. At least this is the current theory. Playas do pond at the lowest point within a unique watershed. When you get those large storms falling down, the rainfall picks up little bits of vegetation that are in the grasslands surrounding a playa and and brings that down with the vegetation into that lowest point, and it sits there in the water. When that happens, you get or when that goes into a into the macropore going below the clay, you start getting vegetation mixing with rainfall. And I don't know the exact process of this, but I am told it forms a very weak carbonic acid. When the water hits that weak carbonic acid hits the soils below, they're often limestone based or caliche, and the carbonic acid starts to eat that limestone away slowly. It's a very slow process, but it does happen. So when when that happens, you start to get deflation of the entire area below the playa basin, where that water is going through the cracks and reducing the amount of caliche that's below there. So that's the current theory about how playas form. You may hear about buffalo wallows. You may hear it's just the wind. You may hear a number of other things about how these playas were created. None of them are true. This may not be true either. This does happen, but it may not be the only reason that playas form. But this is the current theory about what happens. As that process continues over time, playas tend to get bigger. And finally, I want to talk a little, mostly finally, I want to talk a little bit about other types of wetlands that you can find that are ephemeral that you can find in our region. Playas are what are called recharge wetlands. They sit above groundwater, and water infiltrates through the playa and along the edges at a much greater rate than the surrounding grasslands. So they are called recharge wetlands. They're on tighter soils and primarily overlay the Ogallala aquifer. There are parts, especially on the edges of the region from Nebraska down to Texas, defined by the Front Range in Colorado and going east into Kansas. That along the edges of that area where the Ogallala hits, what is in playas may go down to a different aquifer, but primarily they sit over the Ogallala. There are other wetlands. Oh, and I should say, for the purposes of this talk and what I am talking about playas that work in this way with a clay bottom and don't have any saline soils in them. I think there's often especially where I live in New Mexico, a conflation of the term playa to mean both recharge wetlands as well as saline lakes or discharge wetlands. But there is a big difference, and it has to do the reason that it's different is that management is very different for these two types of wetlands. So saline lakes are always connected to groundwater. So there's a spring. The spring may not be running anymore, and the groundwater levels may have dropped, but there is a connection there. And they are discharge wetlands. So when water goes into that basin, it doesn't go anywhere else except evaporates up. They're highly saline, and you can often tell that it's a saline wetland because it has that sort of whitish sand on the outsides where there isn't any water. You see a very whitish bottom. You don't see whitish bottoms on playas with clay bottoms. For those who know Spanish, playa means beach. The assumption is when the Spanish came up here and were asked about that when the Anglos came over here and Spanish were asked what is that, and they were talking about the wetland. It was a dry wetland for the most part, and so the Spanish said it's a playa, which means beach. But that is the term has now come to mean these wetlands, at least in our definition with the Playa Lakes joint venture, these wetlands that are recharge wetlands. Finally, there are interdunal wetlands. These are relatively new to science, if you will. They were sort of discovered by folks in, studied by folks in north central Oklahoma about 10 years ago. And there's a big study going on them in south central Kansas. They're found primarily in sandy soils, which is unlike playas. There's little known about them. They are ephemeral. They do have lots of waterfowl value, but they are, how we manage them and what we do them is not terribly well known at this point. I mention these because even though these we're talking primarily to folks in Colorado, there may be some of these types of wetlands found along the sandier areas of the Arkansas River. Possibly other sandy areas in eastern Colorado, but this is where we suspect that if there are interdunal wetlands in Colorado, this is where they may be. Lastly, I want to mention rainwater basins, which are in this area of Nebraska, right here. And they are very, very similar to playas. There are a couple of differences. Most of these are generally larger, or at least the ones that are still extant. They get more water in general than most of the playas in the region where we are working in Colorado. And there are some invasive issues, and management can be different, somewhat different for these types of playas. I mentioned that for folks in Nebraska. The playas that are in this area of Nebraska, between where the pan meets the panhandle in Nebraska, tend to operate very similarly to those in Colorado and further south. So a couple of thoughts or ideas about how to go identifying playas. Identifying playas from the ground, especially if they're dry, can be challenging. They don't show up very well. It's much better to see them from the air, from satellite imagery, and that is how at least the first set of playa data was gathered, by looking at satellite imagery. The PLJV has a map that you can look at where we have collated data from a number of sources that you can see there on the left, and it's available on our website. You can look at that data set to find playas in your area. There's a caution with that. We know that we have not identified all playas, especially in Colorado, perhaps Nebraska, and New Mexico. We know we're doing better in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. But I would venture to say that even there, we don't know as much as about playas and where they are as we could. Finally, there is another way that you can find playas that is coming into more use, and that's the use of LiDAR. This is just a look at playas that have been determined by the PLJV soil surveys and adding all that data together. And then this is showing what additional playas can show up on the landscape when you're using LiDAR. So that's another way to find playas or determine where playa basins might be. There are a number of other tools that you can find on the PLJV's website. There are a list of them over there on the left. I want to just mention this website here, playasworkforkansas.com. It is a great resource for folks who are looking at doing playa restoration, especially for landowners who are looking for playa restoration on their land. It includes a restoration guide, which is more a series of questions to be answered by the folks in the area doing the playa restoration. So it can be used both by restoration specialists or folks who are doing, biologists who are doing work on the ground, as well as landowners themselves. I think we're about done. We should stop for questions, and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Christopher. Does anyone have any questions? We're going to dive in a little bit more to things like soils and hydrology and restoration, some of the topics that Christopher just touched on. But does anyone have any questions on kind of the basics of Playas?
Hey, where can we find that LiDAR map?
Those LiDAR maps are often available by state. I know in New Mexico, that's where we're finding it. We don't have, I don't think that LiDAR data is available region wide. But you'll have to check with folks. Is this Tabin talking?
Yes, sir.
I think in Texas, you may have to look for check your own check TPWD's GIS center and ask them if they have that information.
Thanks, Christopher.
Other questions?
Hi, Christopher. This is Megan Podolinsky at Colorado State University. I was curious about the PLJV map, and it just seems kind of strange that the playas seem to stop right at the Wyoming border. And I was curious the reason for that. I don't know if they're just not giving you data or, yeah.
So let me go back to that. Well, shall I share my screen again? Let's try that.
Yeah, we've got some time on the agenda, so feel free to, pull up the screen.
Okay. They stopped there at the Wyoming border because the PLJV stops there. We work with folks at in Nebraska, and so we often include that for the Ogallala. There's a little bit of the Ogallala that sits over Nebraska, but that is an artifact of not including data that is there, as opposed to a fact and that playas don't actually stop there at the state line. It's just an artifact of not using the data.
Okay. I figured, but I was just curious. Thank you.
It's yeah.
And I
Good
believe
question.
PLJV, Christopher, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think PLJV has on their website, if you go on their website, you can download shape files of mapped playas, and they're not bounded by PLJV's work boundary. Is that right, Christopher?
The shape files of playas on our website are only they're only within the county levels. If you could download, so they are just for the counties that are found within the Playa Lakes joint venture.
Oh, they are. Okay, my mistake. Other questions? All righty. Well, then I'm going to hand it over to Andy and Mary Ellen to talk about soils. Andy, do you want me to share my screen or would you like to share yours?
I will go ahead and give it a try here.
Okay.
See if I can drive
Alrighty.
straight. And are we seeing anything yet?
Yep, we see it. It's just not in presentation mode yet.
Yeah, it's probably because I picked the wrong screen here.
No, you're good. If you click that, you were down by it before in the bottom right, the icon just next to your view scale, your percentage view scale.
Yeah, I got it. I have too many screens here on my desk, so it's showing up on a different.
Everybody who has multiple monitors feels this pain.
Yeah, I thought I picked the right one.
Try slideshow up on your top menu there, next to animations. Yeah, and then from beginning on the way on the left, try that. Let's see.
All right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to stop sharing and try this again.
Okay.
and see if I can't pick the right screen this time. Darn, I thought I was going to get this right. Come on here.
Well, and I know you with NRCS, Andy, you guys mostly are on Teams. So it's trying to swap between Teams and Zoom can be funky.
Yeah. All right, I might get this right now.
Yep, that looks great.
That look better?
Yep, perfect.
Sorry about that, everybody. Darn, I thought I was going to get that right. So now I get to be the guilty party. But anyway, again, my name's Andy Steinert. I am a soil scientist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service out here in Fort Morgan, Colorado. Our soil survey office covers pretty much all of Northeast Colorado, and we do stretch into Western Nebraska and into Southeastern Wyoming. So we cover a lot of that area where we're seeing a lot of the playas. The big focus of our job is we're the ones providing that Surgo soils data to you all, and also the data that you may be pulling from Web Soil Survey. That's the big focus of our job. So that's me and our crew going out there and looking at all these soils. Kind of real quick to touch on the question from Megan about whether there's any playas in Wyoming. We are in the future going to look more at the playas and the soils data associated with them up here in Northeast Colorado and into kind of Western Nebraska, and also if they do exist over there in Wyoming as well. So maybe we'll be able to provide a little bit better data and knowledge if there is many in Southeast Wyoming. But for today, I'll try to keep watch on the time too. As Christopher said, I'm just as bad about talking and not paying attention to the time. So Anna, feel free to just cut me off or yell at me.
I got you. We're ahead of schedule, so you can take your time.
Okay. Well, and I'm not in a soil pit, so I may not talk as long either, but so just want to give you some basics about soils, the playa soils specifically here. So feel free if you guys got questions at the end to ask. I wanted to just kind of keep this as a high cut. I'm not going to talk too much on hydrology regarding the soils because that's going to come up a little bit later, but they definitely are all tied together. And there we go. Hopefully we can see the next slide. So I'm just going to go through kind of a typical profile of what the soil looks like in our playas. So typically we have an A horizon or an AP horizon if the soil has been farmed or tilled. It's all the P means on there. As I think most people probably know, our topsoil or our A horizons typically are darker in color, and that darker color tends to come from a higher amount of organic matter in the soil. It's, whether it's native vegetation or crop residues collecting in there, hence why the surfaces tend to be darker in color. The picture on the right is just giving you an example of what a dark surface may look like. That picture is not actually from a playa. So just keep that in mind. It's more about what an A horizon would look like there and the dark color associated with it. Typically in our playas, we tend to have the silt loam and loam textures on the surface, but we can get silty clay loam and clay loam textures as well. Sometimes those get intermixed together, depending if tillage has happened in there. But kind of one of the key things is they tend to have less than 35% clay in those surface soil textures. Doesn't mean you can't find clay or silty clay textures on the surface in places, but in general, these are the textures we tend to find there. I did some looking, and roughly 2 to 10 inches thick is what our surface horizons tend to be in the playas out here. And a lot of this is mostly, we're talking kind of eastern Colorado playas. I haven't done a lot of work in playas yet in Nebraska, and I have not done any in Kansas either, but based on our current data and what I have seen out there, this is kind of the general thickness of a surface horizon in our playas. Permeability tends to be moderately slow to moderately rapid in that surface horizon, and that's solely dependent on what the surface texture is out there. Once you start adding management in there and those kind of things, the permeability could be a little bit different there as well. Christopher talked about, some or typical playas out here don't have salts in them. That's my footnote here at the bottom. We do have seen some playas out here in eastern Colorado that do have some salts in the surface and visible on the surface. Though we haven't done a lot of work on those particular playas to really know, are those getting fed by groundwater in place of typical playa that's fed by run-in from water and rainfall events kind of thing. So in our future soil survey update work, we hope to kind of address that and see if those areas are different. Some of our playas, once you get below the A horizon, have what we call an E horizon. The E stands for eluviated. Things have been removed or moved out of there. In the photo here on the right, that photo is actually from within a playa in Nebraska. And that alluvial horizon, if you can see my cursor, it's this lighter colored horizon just below the surface and above the heavy clay soils. As you can see here, they may, they're not overly common out here in some places in eastern Colorado, and it's in relation to climate and the precip we get. It takes a lot of ponding in those playas and often enough to start moving and stripping things out of that horizon and moving it down. So just because you don't see an E horizon in a particular playa does not disqualify it by any means for being a playa. It just may not have ponded water long enough and in enough years to start moving things down below that particular horizon. Typically, the things that get moved out of there is the aluminum, iron, clay, organic matter. It's like I said, it's basically stripping everything out of there and leaving no color. That's why you get that kind of white layer in there. So the textures tend to be very similar to what the soil surface is, because in theory, that horizon was part of the surface A horizons. It's just been stripped of the items I have listed there above. And you can see they tend to be, in the data I've looked at, 1 to 5 inches thick. So permeability, again, is very similar to what the surface horizon is as well. And again, that's because that E horizon at one point in time used to also be an A horizon before everything got stripped out of there. Our B horizons, this is the horizon where we get the heavy clay starting to show up in there. This is where we're getting the high shrink swell clay that provides the cracks when the playas are dry. It's also where they swell shut when it does get wet. This is also why the playas, one of the reasons why the playas are ponding water is because when this heavy clay swells shut, the permeability becomes slow to very slow in there. They tend to have some very well-developed soils. As far as soil structure goes, you'll see blocky structure and or prismatic structure in there. The photo in the upper right there shows kind of typically what some blocky soil structure would look like. And then the picture on the lower, excuse me, right there. If you can see it well, you can see a lot of vertical cracks in that soil. And if you started actually breaking that soil structure out of there, those are prismatics. Prismatic structure has lots of vertical faces associated with it. And it's a feature of sitting there stable for a long time to develop and high clay in the soil. Kind of mentioned it before, but our typical soil textures here in our B horizons, this is where you're getting the clay, the silty clay. You can still get silty clay loam and clay loam textures. The key thing is we're getting greater than 35% clay now in these horizons, which then having that amount of clay, this is where the high shrink swell comes in. So Christopher kind of mentioned it. I kind of hinted on it. When these things are dry, they shrink and open up those big wide cracks. And then when they get moisture back to them, they do swell shut and close those cracks. They can be, you can see here, anywhere from 15 to 65 inches thick, these B horizons. I've seen playas where the B horizon isn't very thick before you're going into like some C material. Then I've also seen some playas where it's, 65 inches thick of this heavy clay material. And the last footnote there, our permeability once these B horizons swell shut. This isn't accounting for when the cracks are still present. The permeability becomes slow to very slow. And again, this is why then you're getting more water ponding on the surface than what is actually infiltrating at that particular time when it is swelled shut. It's also then where the annulus, or sometimes we refer to it as soil scientists as the playa rim, becomes important, where you're getting more water flow and infiltration and deeper infiltration of water along them edges, because those soils tend to be a little bit more permeable. I'll touch on that a little bit more here in a minute. Underneath the B horizons, we tend to get a C horizon. We have very little to no soil structure at times. The photo on the right, if you look in the lower part of it, it's just trying to show some examples of what no structure really looks like in the soil. Again, this isn't a picture from within a playa. It's more about showing you kind of what some C horizons would look like. I did my best to find pictures of soil profiles from playas. I just don't have very many as of yet. The soil textures you can see in our C horizons can be quite variable. We're going back to loams, silt loams. We could still have some silty clay loam in there. Sometimes we do catch some sandier material underneath. If the ogallala material is high enough, we can catch that within a typical profile. I should clarify, a typical profile for us with NRCS and soil scientist is we're looking at 7 feet in depth there. Key thing with those textures, we've dropped, below 35% clay. Not all playas have C horizons, at least within that 7 feet. Like I mentioned before, the B horizons could stretch all the way through that 7 feet range. Calcium carbonates may be present in these lower C horizons. Carbonates tend to move down the soil profile with moisture. So as you can imagine, having water ponded on the surface, if there was carbonates in that surface soil, over time that has all been leached and moved further down the profile. Like I said, they may or may not be present in the C horizon. And you can see our permeability then, based on the soil textures alone, can increase up to moderately rapid or to moderately slow permeability. Again, that's solely based on the soil texture itself. Our playas, talking here on hydric soils, some key things I want to point out. Hydric soils may or may not be present in our playas. It's really all dependent on that duration of ponding out there. We need them to pond long enough to get anaerobic conditions to get these features showing up in the soil profile as a starting point. It's the photograph in the upper right there shows a very good example of a redoxymorphic feature of oxidized iron. Those rusty orange colors you see in there are concentrations of iron. That's one indicator. And then the photo on the lower right is an example of iron that has not been oxidized. So that is still an anaerobic condition, and it gives a very gray color typically to the iron in there. The key thing with these redoxymorphic features in our playas is they tend to show up in the upper part of the soil profile because our water is getting ponded on the surface. If we're finding these features deeper in the profile in our C or lower B horizons, then we might start thinking about that playa is getting fed by groundwater and not by water ponding on the surface. One thing I do want to point out again here in that fourth bullet is just because we see redoxymorphic features in the soil does not instantly mean it's a hydric soil. There are still indicators and criteria that you have to meet to actually be considered a hydric soil. So just they're not one and the same. I just want to make sure we're aware of that. And also going with that, the last bullet there, just because we have a hydric soil does not also mean it's a wetland based on our wetland criteria for NRCS purposes anyway. You still also have to have that hydrophytic vegetation and the wetland hydrology out there to be classified as a wetland. Again, at least based on our criteria with NRCS. Our soil survey data will provide this information if it's a hydric soil or not as a starting point. It doesn't replace going on site and looking in a particular playa to see if you're seeing these features and meeting the criteria for a hydric soil. Just kind of wanted to compare here, kind of, playa soil versus a non-playa soil, just to give you some general ideas. So a playa soil, landform wise, you've heard the term playa. Sometimes a playa is referred to as a closed depression. The main thing is, and key feature is, there's no outlet for this water to go on the surface. It ponds there, or it either evaporates or infiltrates. There's no outlet. Non-playa soil tends to be found on the uplands or the tablelands. I wish I could remember what features Christopher used in his presentation. He had a very good slide there that showed, what these landform positions were up outside of the playa. These upland and tableland positions, these are runoff positions. Any rain that is falling on those positions and not infiltrating is moving off and going into a run-on position, as we call it, which is a playa and or closed depression. Our playa soils, as soil scientists, we rate them, they should have a ponding frequency associated with them. Typically out here, they can range from rare to frequent ponding, and that's highly dependent on precip. As we go from eastern Colorado further into Nebraska, Kansas, they get more precipitation that way. So the odds are they're going to have a higher ponding frequency based on our classification than the ones maybe out here in eastern Colorado. Our non-playa soils shouldn't have a ponding frequency. They're shedding water. They're not ponding water. Again, just a wrap here on the subsoil. The playa soils tend to have that high clay subsoil in there that has, equal to or greater than 35% clay, high shrink swell. Typically, our non-playa soils don't have that amount of clay in the subsoil in general, but we do have soils outside of a playa or closed depression landform that can have subsoils that have greater than 35% clay in there. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's kind of a general thing. You can see the permeability in our playas tend to be slow to very slow, where the soils outside of the playas tend to have more of a moderately slow to moderately rapid permeability. Key feature of a playas soil is the high shrink swell, cracks when dry, swell shut when moist. Our non-playas soils tend to have low to moderate shrink swell in there, and it's really all dependent on the amount of clay in that soil profile. As Christopher kind of mentioned too, here the last little blurb here in our diagram is that our initial flush of water infiltrates through those large vertical cracks in the playa from when the soil is dry. And then as it moistens, those cracks swell shut, the infiltration and permeability slows, and then we get ponding occurring on the surface. Our non-playa soils, along the playa rim or the annulus, as Christopher related to it, infiltration increases along there after the playa swells shut and the permeability drops in the playa. These higher permeable soils along the outside, then water is moving that way and easier for it to infiltrate into the soil based on the higher permeability of those soils. So here's the contact information for Mary Ellen and myself. Feel free to reach out to us for any soil questions related to playas. As I mentioned before, we're continuing to do soil survey update work in our playas. We get wetland requests at times in our playas looking at the soils. So feel free to reach out to either one of us. Mary Ellen covers all of Northeast Colorado as well. I think she may have mentioned that in the introduction. And again, our soil survey office covers Eastern Colorado, parts of Western Nebraska, and Southeast Wyoming. And with that, I will open it up to any questions.
Thanks, Andy. I have a question and then a comment that maybe you can, the comment you can speak to is, for those folks who are on the call who are with NRCS, with Colorado or otherwise, Andy pointed out there's a difference between hydric soils versus a wetland versus a playa, and that's going to be relevant with use of practices and standards and specifications for where practices can be implemented and where they can't be. And so, Andy, I don't know if you have anything to add, but I wanted to flag that is an important distinction when we talk about hydric soils, wetlands, playas, these different systems that are all similar but are not exclusive, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to point out. Just because you see redoxomorphic features, that doesn't mean that it's instantly a hydric soil, and then that doesn't instantly mean it's a wetland either. It takes certain criteria and features to meet a hydric soil, and then it also takes, like I said, the hydrophytic vegetation and hydrology indicators to be a wetland. So sometimes people want to intermix that they just assume you have a hydric soil, that it's a wetland, and that's not the case. So, because it's very important to whether it's a wetland or not when it comes to, like what you said, planning and restoration and those kind of things.
Thanks, Andy. And I have one other question for folks from other states who are on the call. Andy, you mentioned at the beginning of your slides, that there might have been differences in those soil horizons for playas between states, and that you were really speaking to what it looks like in northeastern Colorado in particular. So I'm wondering if there's folks from other states who know of major differences to keep in mind in terms of soil profiles on playas across the region. Maybe there isn't, but figured I'd open it up for opportunity to draw out those distinctions.
Yeah, there, I mean, in general, that's kind of the typical profiles of and characteristics you're going to see of the playas. We do my counterparts over in Hays, Kansas, just did a lot of work last year on the playas and the soils associated with them in far western Kansas and into Colorado a little bit. So they will have better and more up-to-date soil survey information for those. Our counterparts down in Pueblo, Colorado did the same thing on the playas down in southeast Colorado within I don't know how many years it's been now, but um, so you should be able to, our soil survey data should be able to show that, but there shouldn't be drastic differences in there as far as just the general soil properties go, if that answers the question.
I just, and I want to bring up one part, just that something that can be confusing on the non-playa soils to playa is that management compaction. You can also get ponding in non-playa soils just from how the management is. You get a lot of machinery across. And so you can see ponding in places that aren't playas in the uplands. And it just it can make things a little bit more confusing.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. So if you had a planner or you had a conservation practitioner on a landscape and there was a really compacted area that was ponding water, what should they look for to check if that is a playa or not? And then obviously then the management or the restoration changes. Are there distinctive features that you would recommend folks look for?
Well, these maps sound, I hadn't seen those maps before, and I was wondering if we might ask Michael Troyer to put those maps onto CD, onto
Sure.
our conservation desktop. That's a thought I've had this morning. And I guess your clay, if you look and you can have ponding on something that's like a sandy loam that has no clay in it, or the silt loam. So I think that's one thing we'd be looking for. And your closed position.
Yeah.
You can have ponding where it's really not the lowest part of the landscape just because of management, because of machinery that's gone across. Yeah. So it's just a thought that, just because it's ponded doesn't mean necessarily that it's the playa. And I think that makes things a little confusing, that there's not just one way to get that kind of a feature.
Hey, Mary and Andy, this is Abe Lawler with Ducks Unlimited. Would you guys by chance have a list of soil names and or classes that represent Colorado playas? Like for instance, a tilled clay that we have here in Western Kansas is Nest clay, which is 2714. About 99% of the time when those soil layers are pulled up in our local USDA offices, it's pretty easy to tell that that area is a playa, along with lodgepole pine, Lubbock, Lyman clay, Nebel. Those are pretty easy to tell that they're soils that represent playas. Does Colorado have that list out for the local offices to maybe help them identify those playas?
This is Andy. I don't know if there's actually a list that we have. I know if the playas, how do I want to say this? There is a few soil series in eastern Colorado that should and only be found in playas. Lodgepole is one, and I could write these in the chat too. Pleasant is the other big one that I would look for. Now, there may, with the work that our Hays, Kansas office did, there may be another one that's going to get added into Colorado. I just can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But those Lodgepole and Pleasant are typically found in Playas. The caution is we're trying to update our soils data and make things consistent. So there could still be some instances where you see, like, I think you mentioned even the Lyman soil. That typically in Colorado is not found in a playa. It's found on a different landform position. So there's a little caution there, that it's not all inclusive as of yet. Those are things we're trying to update and make better. But
Gotcha. Well, I think a list for the county offices, like keep your eye out for that. This is kind of tied to these type of soils. I think that'd be helpful for them when they're planning restorations with producers.
I like that idea. That's a really good idea, actually, because those soils not currently don't all get designated as hydric soils. If they're designated as hydric soils in our soil survey data, then it kind of flags our field offices that there's potential for wetlands out there, kind of thing. But that's been inconsistently done in the past. And again, that's something we're trying to fix as well. But I like your idea of just having a list. Like, that makes it quick and easy for our planners or any customers really to see, like, oh, hey, I see these soils on a map, and they typically are found in a playa. Like, makes it quick and easy. I do see my list here. The other soil that might start showing up in Kansas on our maps is called Ness.
Yep, that's clay.
Ness. Yeah.
Yep, 2714. Got that one memorized. But yeah, well, cool.
Andy, is there the possibility that Colorado MLRA staff will do a similar playa exploration as what they did with the Hayes field office in the future?
Yes, I'm hoping that is my next, or our office here in Fort Morgan's next big field project, is to expand upon the work that they did throughout the rest of Northeast Colorado and into Western Nebraska and into Southeast Wyoming, if those soils exist over there as well. So that's number one on my priority list, just so we can, then I think all the playas, at least soil survey wise, have been looked at and the data updated recently in Colorado. So yes, stay tuned.
That will be great. And what A was saying about having a list of the playa soils is a fantastic opportunity and a way to be able to look. And it, won't tell you if there's a playa there, but it gives you the possibility and gives you the ability to look at the soil map and say, hey, there's a possibility of a playa here. So yeah, that would be really nice to have. Thanks for bringing that up, Abe.
Are there any other questions?
Okay, y'all can see the screen again?
Yep.
Cool. So wanted to talk a little bit about why playas are important, what folks should think about them, what folks should know about them, and perhaps their relevance to people that you're talking to on the landscape. But also the relevance of you if you are working to get funding for playas in our area. So we'll go over this. Why people care. It's important to understand this. The Playa Lakes Joint Venture has done a little bit of work with this, and I'll get into that in just a bit. The importance to state and federal agencies, and then it's a the last thing is Playas is a living entity, and when we get to there, it's just an interesting thought that's come up in some recent literature that is intriguing to us at the joint venture. So first of all, let's just talk about some of the benefits of playas. When water comes through the system from the uplands and goes down into the ponding or into the macropores that are in the clay layer, they do some filtering. That clay layer does some filtering. The grass buffer itself filters out a lot of sediment, but the clay layers do some filtering of the soils as well, through the soils as well. So it traps some contaminants. There is additional groundwater quantity that or water that infiltrates towards that area through the playa layer itself, rather than as opposed to the surrounding uplands. Sometimes 10 to as much as 1,000 times greater than the surrounding uplands. For folks who have houses or roads or other infrastructure near playa lakes, they can assist with floodwater retention and storage. Sometimes EPA actually looks at digging out playas, which can be important for you to know around communities that have lots of playas around them, in order to increase development. It doesn't happen in very many areas, but around some of the larger towns in around the edges of the Ogallala, Lubbock, Amarillo, Clovis, New Mexico, Oklahoma City. Well, not Oklahoma City. That's too far west, east. But other large areas that tend to be growing or have grown. EPA floodwaters planning can be an issue for playas. There's a lot of carbon sequestration through playas. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. They are biodiversity hotspots. So when you're looking across the prairies, which is the only place that playas exist, and in particular, relatively flat prairies, the species richness is higher for plants, amphibians, and birds in grasslands that have playas versus those that don't. And finally, there's opportunities for hunting, wildlife viewing, and scenery. I was conflating the two words. We have done some work. We pulled a bunch of hydrologists, other soil scientists together, and communication folks, and asked them, what are the things that we can say as we're messaging to other individuals who are interested in playas or thinking about doing playa restoration? And they are a major source of recharge for the Ogallala. Recharge cannot make up for what we are currently irrigating, mining from the Ogallala through irrigation. And that's an important thing to remember. But it is enough, the recharge is enough to support rain-fed operations, grazing operations, and for the most part, most municipalities dependent on that, the Ogallala. The average across the entire region from Nebraska down into Texas is 3 inches per year. I think this is a fairly conservative estimate, going with the range going between 1 inch of recharge per year up to 10 inches per year. Again, people talk about in areas where I am in New Mexico, that there's just not a lot of rain that they're getting, and so the playas are dry. But this is a regional average per year across through playas. So it's actually a lot more water going into recharge than you might think with every single rainstorm, and that's important to remember. Doesn't seem a lot. Certainly, if you are judging the amount of water that is ponded in a playa basin and saying that is not a whole lot of water, you are correct. And we'll get to a little bit about that in just a moment. If you conserve a playa, that water is basically yours. So if you're talking to landowners and they have wells within about 3/4 to a mile to a mile and a quarter, the water that is going through a playa today is going to be yours. There is a very slow lateral flow underneath. There's a quicker flow below, but it is not all that quick. The lateral flow, however, has been measured at 1 inch to maybe 10 inches per year, at least in areas in Texas and southeastern New Mexico, which is where I know that the lateral flow has been studied. Healthy playas with buffers and improved water quality. And we've talked about that. This is the average recharge rate across a 4-acre playa. It's a lot of water. When you start talking playa basins that are 500 to 1,000 acres, you're actually talking about very large basins, and that can be even more water. For the larger playas, which tend to be in Texas, there can be a huge amount of recharge going through some of these playa basins. But even with just a 4-acre playa, there's this estimate about 320,000 gallons each year. It's enough to feed or water a family of 4 for 2 years. Their playas are keystone ecosystems, and so they really are important to the biodiversity of the entire prairie system. Here you see some of the numbers of animals that are affected. Migratory stopover sites, they're primary migratory stopover site for birds in the Central Flyway, especially for waterfowl. More and more we are seeing waterfowl use our rivers in the wintertime, such as the North and South Platte, less so the Arkansas, but still they are, the playas themselves during migration are critically important, not just for waterfowl, but other birds that use that require water as well, shorebirds and other water birds such as terns, gulls, and herons. Here's the slide on carbon storage. It's been studied and looks at the amount of soil carbon that is that is held within playa basins as opposed to the surrounding uplands. And it's great for recreation, for those who are waterfowl hunters, for those who are bird watchers, for those who just enjoy the look of water on the landscape in the prairies. This can be, the playas are wonderful for that kind of recreation. In some areas, folks are using playas for duck clubs and making a fair amount of money off it. And I know this is especially prevalent in Texas, but it could be used in other areas. I want to talk a little bit about the importance to agencies. This is more from perhaps a funding standpoint. In Colorado, in the State Wildlife Action Plan, they list playas are listed within the State Wildlife Action Plan as an important habitat. There are a number of species associated with SGCNs, or species of greatest conservation need, associated with playas. Here's that list from the Colorado State Wildlife Action Plan. I have taken out a couple of species that were just listed for these ephemeral wetlands in the San Luis Valley and western Colorado. In addition, birds of conservation concern list for the Fish and Wildlife Service lists the number of birds that are associated with playas throughout the what's called Bird Conservation Region 18, which is relatively coincident with both the Playa Lakes Joint Venture boundaries as well as all of eastern Colorado. It includes southwestern Nebraska, western Kansas, the panhandle of Oklahoma, and most of the panhandle of Texas and eastern New Mexico as well. EPA not only it can be a problem for playas with their flood assurance plans, but also they will help provide money for studying of playas, and I know that's happened in a couple of EPA regions within the Playa Lakes Joint Venture region and within the shortgrass prairie. And then finally, I want to talk about this. This is a nice paper that was done by Dave Hokus, who's a playa expert, now stationed at Kansas State. And he has studied playas for most of his life. First is Texas Tech, which is where a lot of the early playa information came from, and now he's at Kansas State. But this particular paper talks about the ecosystem of individual playas, and then looking at playas as a network, so that if you take out about 60% of all the playas that are in the function in the playa system right now, you basically have a system that is defunct. It won't, the playas won't contain the kind of biodiversity that they currently contain because there aren't enough of them there. We know that for wildlife, if you even with one every playa being wet once every 10 years, there's more waterfowl value to all the playas in western Kansas than there is to Cheyenne Bottoms, which is a well-known wildlife area in in the center of Kansas, and well known and recognized by a number of different agencies as globally important for birds. But there is more value for birds habitat wise in the prairies or in the playa area than there is in that globally known wildlife area. As a result of them, as a result of the interconnectedness of these features. So I just wanted to sort of put this point out there. It's a little hard to understand, but how each playa itself is its own little ecosystem, but they also function together as one particular entity. So I call it a living entity. All the playas within the system. And the important thing to remember that is that if we lose about 60% of the playas that are currently extant, then that whole system sort of starts to disintegrate. Birds that are using that system won't be able to survive the migration further south, or won't use the area at all. And other creatures that are dependent upon primarily birds to transfer them between wetlands will also not survive. Finally, I want to talk, and the reason that I talk about losing playas is there's a term that was coined by David Hokus that's called its term is fossil playa, and that's basically playas that still have the soils remaining, but they have been primarily farmed through, and there's so much sediment now in that playa bottom that you cannot, for the most part, tell it from either LiDAR or from looking at it on the landscape. It functions. It may look like it may have a little ponding going on for a few days, but with soil evaporation, it's gone. And it's an interesting term, one that we're starting to use more and more as we look at playas. But there are a number of playas that I personally know that where folks have told me this is where the playa is. I go there and look, and there is nothing there now. When they send me photos of it, they are photos from the 1930s that have waves on this wetland. And there's nothing there now that would at all approximate that. And it's what I call, and what Dave Hokus calls, a fossil playa. That is happening with playas, and why it's important to maintain this whole system, not only in Colorado, but across the entirety of the playa range in the U.S. And with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
Thanks, Christopher. You've got a request in the chat for a citation on the caucus paper you referenced.
I
so
will
throw that in there at some point.
Yeah, I will try and get that. It may not be today, it will, but I can get that out to everybody, to you on Monday. Yeah.
Yeah, send it out to me. And for everybody on this call, I will be sending out the recording as well as a couple other things to folks who RSVP'd. So we can make sure we get that citation in that email. Yes, Ted, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Christopher, good to hear from you. Any knowledge about the importance of playas and the network for pollinators, especially pollinators that migrate. And we did a little work in the rainwater basin on that. Just seems like it's something that if we don't have those data, might be important to be looking at.
I am not aware of any, Ted, but it certainly should be looked at if it hasn't been looked at.
All right, thank you.
I wonder, Patty, do you know anything about pollinators with playas? I know you do. You've got knowledge on pollinators in general, and then obviously knowledge on playas too. So, or anybody else on the call.
And this is Ted again, that we did have a study done in the rainwater basin playas, one of Lauren Smith's students. So there's some papers out on that. So, but I haven't seen others. So.
Hey, Chris. This is Abe Lawler with Ducks Unlimited in here in Kansas. With those fossil playas, they're still eligible for USDA programs, correct?
As I would think that as long as they fit the definition of that is needed by USDA, they would be. I'm not sure that you'll find, however, that as Andy was talking about earlier, that you'll find the wetland plants that may be needed if a wetland designation is required. I can't say, I don't know the rules within each state for NRCS, so I can't say that, or FSA. So I can't speak to that directly.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Just to jump in on that briefly, though, a wetland designation is not required for participation in most NRCS programs. So our voluntary, I'm sure Patty will discuss this more, our voluntary EQIP, CSP, we could definitely do playa restoration where it was not a NAFSAM wetland. It did not have those three characteristics. We could still restore it. We could still spend money to seed it, to remove sedimentation, or conversely to put the soil back in. All of that could be covered under an NRCS program.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. At one point, and I will say this, at one point, I know that especially in Kansas, a wetland designation was required for certain practices. I don't know if that's still the case, and you'll know better than I, Abe, in Kansas.
Yep.
Well, Christopher, I'm going to have you roll into your next section. And we'll have time for questions after that section as well. So if folks have questions related to this session just now, we can wrap those in, or from the previous sessions, we can always answer those throughout the day. So let's have you hop into the next one, Christopher.
Okay, and I'm still sharing my screen?
You are, yep. Okay.
So now we'll get into those some of those threats. We talked about fossil playas already, but just want to take a look at some of the threats to natural hydrology that you can find in playas. First of all, again, as I think I mentioned before, any playa work that is done when you don't have a grass buffer, you're basically wasting your money. All playa restorations need to have a grass buffer, otherwise you won't stop the additional sediment from coming into a playa basin. And it's absolutely critical to get that grass buffer around. That tends to be the number one threat to playas across the entire region. For those playas that already have a grass buffer, you're already that far much ahead. What happens when you get excess sediment going into a playa basin? It limits the water holding capacity, pushing it out further onto the landscape, over the annulus, and up into the surrounding uplands. If you get a lot of sediment in there, it decreases the amount of recharge that happens, One thing I will say this, we don't know exactly how much it decreases, but we do know that when you get to the point of having so much sediment that you can't tell that a playa is there, and you've reached basically fossil playa status, that recharge basically stops. So there still needs a lot of work that needs to be done on determining how much sediment means how much decrease in recharge or infiltration. It does affect wildlife habitat to a great degree when you have a lot of sediment in there and you have fossilization going on. Here's a diagram of what happens with playas. The other thing is you see is that when you increase the amount of sediment in a playa basin, it spreads the water out further and you get increased evaporation. So the water that's ponding in a playa at that point also doesn't stay there as long and reducing its value to wildlife. Here's an example from a playa in New Mexico that I have worked with personally. One of the interesting things about sediment is that when you get waterways, such as this one here, or channels, one that you can sort of see right here, which it was an old roadbed actually that was leading into the playa basin. And sediment coming in from a waterway here that is from a culvert from a bar ditch. You get lots more sediment moving into the playa basin. What happens then is like what happens with any waterway that has a lot of sediment in it, you start to get a delta, basically, or what we call a sediment plume. And they're easily seen here on satellite imagery if there's enough sediment there, especially if there's water in the playa. They're not quite as easy to see if you have a dry playa, but the vegetation will change on those sediment plumes versus the surrounding playa vegetation when you're in the playa basin itself. So when you're talking about putting buffers in, and sometimes there are folks who want to get buffers, their playa conserved, they want to put a buffer around that playa, but they also may want to farm the rest of the field around that. Hocus did another study, and I'll get the citation for that as well, that looked at how much grass was needed around a playa to get the maximum benefit, and the sort of sweet spot for benefit for sediment removal as well as contaminants removal. And that turns out to be about 30 meters of grass surrounding that playa. So you can have a playa restored within a field and still continue to farm the field as long as you have about 100 feet, a little over 100 feet of grass surrounding the playa in all directions. I will point out that it needs to be 30 meters in all directions from the playa basin rather than a composite of grass in one area that equals the area of 30 meters. What I mean by that is that some people like to square off the buffer around the playa, and this has been done in the past. And there are areas where the edge is less than 30 meters and areas where the edge is much further than 30 meters away from the playa basin. That is not as helpful as doing completely around. This picture is nice because it shows a playa buffer well within a farm field, but I can tell you that 30 meters was not achieved with these two particular playas. Other modifications include pits and ditches. I keep doing this. This is a picture of a typical playa pit. Pits are often dug in playas. First, they were dug in irrigated areas and used as reuse pits. In other words, they would put water up on the landscape, flood irrigate, water would flow down into the playa basin, and then would be pumped back up to the top where it would be reused and flood the fields again. That kind of irrigation is, for the most part, no longer happening in the Great Plains, anywhere in the Great Plains, but the playa ditch, the playa pit still still exists there. Cattlemen use it to concentrate water in a playa basin to keep water there for longer. And that still happens in many areas with grassland playas. The issues with that is your water quality sort of starts to deteriorate at that point. If cattle stay in there for a good amount of time, you can imagine the kinds of algae that grow in playa pits when they are wet still. There are other contaminants that are then added to the water in that area. Some folks don't like that kind of water quality for their cattle. It reduces water surface area because it concentrates a good amount of water in one particular area. Other parts of the playa may function naturally, but it reduces the overall amount of infiltration that's happening underneath the playa basin. And when you fill these pits or ditches, it's one of the easiest ways to restore a playa. We have asked around and looked around and done some experimentation ourselves. All you need is a dirt mover to push the pit, the spoils pile into the pit and walk away. No need to worry about tamping it down, making sure it's flat. That will happen with actually pretty quickly with the next refilling. There's no need to make sure that everything is exactly level. Everything will all level out naturally. What we're doing primarily is simply helping Mother Nature along, because the spoils piles that are often surrounding a pit will erode eventually back into and fill the pit, but that takes a lot longer time than any of us have if we're worried about restoring playas. There are other types of modifications that happen. Ditches as well can move water from a larger area within the playa to the pit. This does not have a picture of that, but you can see from satellite imagery, it's often very easy to tell what is a playa pit, and in fact where the spoils piles are. When you're looking at a playa that is ponded but not to the point that it's covering up the spoils piles actually stand out distinctly in a ponded playa. Roads can be another problem, but there are good ways that you can help to ameliorate those actions. What's happening here, I really like the photo of the road going through this playa. This is a paved road going through a playa. That is a dirt road that's going around the right edge of the playa on the what is the right side of that road. The left side, on the left side of the road, a native grassland, and you get you can see the effect of some cow trails that are going through there, and a little bit of sediment plumes that have been happening in a number of different areas along the playa basin there. But for the most part, there is water showing there. There is not a whole lot of water that's showing, although it is still wet, on the right side. And the road is the primary reason that is happening, because it tends to block. It is blocking the water from the surrounding uplands of reaching the playa basin itself. Roads, for the most part, if you have culverts going between wet and dry areas, can often reduce a lot of the or increase a lot of the wildlife damage that may be done by having a road going through a playa without culverts. It's often difficult to get rid of playas. To get rid of roads in playas, but with culverts, there is actually, and that's the only threat that's going on to the playa itself. It doesn't provide. Isn't as bad as one might think, but it does reduce the amount of recharge that's happening directly below the road itself and the surrounding berm on either side. There are folks that I know who have actually decommissioned county roads that are primarily dirt, taken the caliche out, and restored a playa back to almost complete natural function in that way. If you have a dirt road, that can be done. I think the benefit to getting rid of a road, if it's paved, is the benefit of removing that road or rerouting that road is much more costly than the benefit you get out of it. Terraces. We're going to speak a little bit about terracing. We know what terraces do when you walk on an area. If anyone has done this, you find that there's a little bit of ponding, something that Mary Ellen was talking about in areas that wouldn't normally be ponded. Around the upslope area of every terrace, it does reduce the amount of water going into a playa basin. We haven't done a lot of work with how to get this done, how to restore this kind of thing. What we do know, however, is that if you cut through terraces at exactly the same point going into a playa, so that water goes through one area and then immediately goes down slope to another cut in exactly the same area of the terrace below that, and then all the way down to the playa basin, you will start to develop a channel or a waterway at that point. That waterway then needs to be reduced or changed, altered in some way. So we don't recommend that. Some people have talked about offsetting cuts through terraces. We haven't studied those enough to know whether that kind of work will actually, that kind of terrace cutting will work with playas to get all the water going, or most of the water going back down into the playa basin itself. So there are other types of diversions. Bar ditches are the are the perfect example of diversions that maintain water within certain areas and keep the water from expanding out onto the rest of the landscape. This actually is a road that has been dug through a playa. The buildings that are there are on the left are actually on the playa edge. And one of the reasons that the bar ditches are well maintained in this area is to keep those buildings from flooding. So there are other issues with building roads and diversions and reasons that they are built that you may have to account for if you're trying to do restoration on a playa. Finally, just want to note that playa-ration, these are things to keep in mind about what playa restoration works. Native grass buffers, sediment removed, or excess sediment removed and kept out. There are no hydrological modifications for a perfect restoration. Make sure that the playa is going through wet-dry cycles and gets enough water into that from the surrounding landscape to have it pond. And again, you appreciate the ecosystem benefits. When that happens, you often get management and stewardship by the owners, private landowners in particular, who are happy and often very proud to have both the recharge value of that playa happening, but also the wildlife benefit that happens when you have a naturally functioning playa. With that, I'll say thank you. Let me know if we have any questions. My contact information is down there at the bottom should you need that. But you can contact a number of folks from the Playa Lakes Joint Venture if you have questions about playas, and we can get the answers to you regardless of whether it's me or anyone else.
Thank you, Christopher. You've got a hand up from Ashley.
Okay, Ashley, go ahead.
Hey, Christopher. This might be naive, but as you were talking about sedimentation and fossilization, I was wondering, does the annulus feature of a playa move, or is that a stagnant feature on the landscape? And can you tell that feature from soils? Because it seems like a really important feature since so much water is brought down into the aquifer once that playa is filled from that feature. So just curious.
I have not looked specifically at the annulus. I do know that vegetation changes when you reach the annulus. It starts transitioning more to upland vegetation than it does to wetland vegetation, and or if the playa is vegetation free, it's where the vegetation starts. So you have that's one of the ways you can tell where the annulus is. Looking at it on satellite imagery, you can sometimes tell because the vegetation itself has a different color. I don't know enough about soils. That would be something for Andy, but to my knowledge, that really hasn't been studied all that well.
Okay, so there is like over time, and I'm talking long periods of time, it could either expand or contract, possibly.
I'm not sure about contraction. I would imagine, and I want to use that word, it's not studied, that when playas, as playas do enlarge, because they do enlarge over long periods of time, that annulus would also change. But that's just me conjecturing at this point. It's not something that we know.
Sure. Thank you.
Other questions? We had some folks throw citations of some papers in the chat. I am copying these and including them in the email that I'll send out to this group with the recording. But other questions for Christopher or any of the facilitators who have presented so far?
I'll do a shout out to Ted and thank you for putting out those citations. They're very helpful.
Yes, thank you, Ted. And I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick comment, Christopher. Yeah, great presentation. On the tile or on the terraces, we've discussed the idea. I don't know that we've implemented it anywhere. And hate to say this in a wetland crowd, but actually further east, they put in tile lines with stam pipes to pass where they have higher rainfall to pass the water through a terrace system. We have kicked that idea around as a solution where you generally farmers out west, others can confirm this if that's the case, they want that water to soak in because they're in a water short environment. But if the goal is to get that water, keep it from soaking into the uplands behind the terraces, because the terraces, you want them to keep the sediment out, but we want the water to get to the playa, a tile bypass system would be a possibility. Something NRCS does a lot in the east, even eastern Nebraska, but you don't see it in the west. But just a thought for the group.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I like it. When you're trying to look at not creating channels, or in restoring channels or large water flow areas, there are two principles that you want to keep in mind at all times, and that is to slow the water down, first of all. And terraces do a great job of that. But you also want to spread the water out so that you do get a larger area and no concentration of water there. They're basic principles, but following those principles will help you restore waterways almost every time. How that actually occurs can happen in different ways depending on what's happening with the landscape features, where that waterway is going through, and the soils.
Abe, got your hand up.
Yep. I was just kind of curious, Ted, what is the cost ratio doing tile versus waterways, like Chris was saying? And also, too, would that be opening up a new can of worms of draining playas through a tile system?
Well, first, to be clear, Abe, that's why I said you don't want to bring the tile. The tiles would be put in uplands. So you're basically taking water from behind the terraces, ponds behind the terraces, depending on how the terrace is designed. And if that water is behind the terrace, you want to get it passed through the terrace into the wetland. You're actually trying to tile the water from the upland terraces into the wetland to supplement the hydrology to get the water there. So
Yeah, I see what you're
think
saying there, but do we want to open that can of worms of having that opportunity to drain wetlands if
well, a lot of our playas aren't very drainable by tiles because there's no surface ditch or stream to take it to. But that's a good point. You'd have to be careful about that. And again, we haven't done it. We've just talked about that as a possibility. But yeah, good points.
The other question I had there in that was the cost for tile drain versus, creating a water
yeah.
lane and slowing water down, kind of what
Yeah,
Christopher.
that's something I don't have any costs on what that would take to put the tile bypass in. Again, they're just a little standpipe and the tile goes through the terrace. You're not doing a massive tiling project, but it would clearly require excavating and putting that in and the cost of the standpipe and things. But I'm sure here in the east, they kind of NRCS would have some costs on that because it's common practice where you have more rainfall to do that. But I don't know the numbers. So.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see if it would be beneficial to, Western Nebraska, Kansas, or just, High Plains in general. See if that's more cost effective versus trying to create waterways and seeing what type of sedimentation issues that we have within those areas. Be curious to see.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, like Christopher said, cutting those terraces in places to allow the water to pass gets the water there, but it also, as you know, could get the sediment or start some ditch cutting. And so this would be a potential way to get around that, but something we just need to try it somewhere and see how it works, I think.
Agreed.
Other questions or topics for discussion on restoration, or excuse me, not restoration, restoration is after lunch, on threats to playas or the relevance on the landscape, thinking back to Christopher's presentation before the threats about waterfowl usage, and we talked about pollinators a little bit. I think since it's 12:30, I don't want to keep us on schedule. It's a Friday afternoon now. So we are gonna start our afternoon session with discussion around landowners, working with landowners around playa issues. And that's gonna be led by Abe Lawler and Katie Merriweather. So Abe, I think you're starting, right?
Yep.
Okay, and you're sharing your screen. You don't need me to pull it up.
Nope, I'm good. I'll get it up and running here.
Alrighty, thank you. And if I can get some thumbs up from people that we're back, and I'm not talking to ghosts here.
You're
Well,
back.
then I see thumbs up. Yay, thank you. Alrighty, all you, Abe.
All right. Well, thanks, Anna, and thanks everybody for being on the call today. I've been very informative from Chris and everybody else's input from the Colorado side of things. But my talk today is kind of showing a model that has shown success here in Kansas. And kind of the big takeaways I want you guys to have today is kind of get a better understanding of who Ducks Limited is, how this Kansas model, how we communicate with landowners and partners, and why this model has seen so much success here in the last 5 years. So 10,000-foot overview of who Ducks Limited is. We are a research or a conservation research organization that was formed back in the 1930s, right after the Dust Bowl, by a group of conservationists that just so happened to be duck hunters. They saw waterfowl populations crash right after the Dust Bowl, and they said, "Hey, we need to form an organization that's going to assist our federal agencies on waterfowl populations." So they came together and formed this group called Ducks Unlimited, with the mission in mind to conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North American waterfowl. Shortly after us doing several projects that are benefiting North American waterfowl, we found out that our projects also benefit other wildlife and, more importantly, benefit people. So we actually added on to our mission statement that our projects have to benefit other wildlife and people. So yes, we work at a continental scale. Up to the north, we have a sister organization called Ducks Unlimited Canada. And then here in the United States, we have Ducks Unlimited Inc. And to our southern border, we have Ducks Unlimited de Mexico, which all share the same mission as stated above, but we also share the same vision to have sufficient wetlands to fill the skies with waterfowl today, tomorrow, and forever. So not only do we work north to south and south to north, but we work from west to east and east to west. So we work in 4 different flyways: the Atlantic, Pacific, Mississippi here in the blue. And the largest flyway that we have here in North America is the Central Flyway, where Colorado and Kansas reside. This slide is a little out of date. We're probably reaching closer to like 17 or 18 million acres to date. And with all these green dots, it shows you where Ducks Unlimited has had a footprint, whether it's to conserve, restore, manage, and or enhance wetlands all across the North American continent. And yes, we do work in Hawaii. We do work in Alaska. We work all across Kansas, or not Kansas, Canada, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So we have a pretty large footprint and have several projects. And this is just kind of show you the where we work and where we've targeted a lot of our projects. So that's a 10,000 foot overview of who Ducks Unlimited is and kind of where we work. Getting into the meat and potatoes of this conversation is how our Kansas model is working, or how our Kansas water model is working for Ply Lake conservation. And that really starts out with landowner communication. And everybody asks, well, where do you start, or how do you start those conversations? And this is just me speaking from experience, what I've seen success with, as well as several of our biologists, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks biologists have shared as well. And the first thing is, being in a semi-arid environment, you got to follow the rain. We're just like anybody else. When you have a large rainstorm that falls, you want to see what happens. Farmers are the exact same way. From my experience, the best way to communicate with landowners is getting out in the field and seeing what they're seeing. And there's several different tools that we use. I don't know how people are in Eastern Colorado or New Mexico or Texas or whoever else is on the line, what other states they're from, but I know a lot of our Kansas biologists are really tied into their apps, their weather apps, and seeing where rain is falling. And we have a very, very good app called Coco Raws, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And you can see exactly how much rain is falling. For instance, back in the first part of July, southeastern Colorado had over a 4-inch rain. And I would guarantee that there is some flooding that was happening and some plies that had some standing water. And those plies with standing water is probably the best time to talk to a landowner and or a tenant about Ply Lake conservation, and why what has been already been stated earlier today of the importance of Playas, not only for migratory birds and other wildlife, but also benefiting people when it comes to groundwater recharge. And this Coco Raws map, that for those who haven't seen this before, this is public information that anybody can access, and you can see where the rain has fallen. So you're following your weather app, you see that there's a big thunderstorm that rolled through on X day. You can see how much rain was dropped in that area. Again, this is just another picture to show you that we all know that these thunderstorms that roll through the area, they can drop a whole bunch of rain in one spot and leave other spots dry. So understanding where that water is being dumped is very important when it comes to going out and looking at playas. And I will say that the majority of my success is going out and looking at these playas from the road, just glassing them with some field glasses or binos. And I would say about 75% of the time when I'm doing that, there's either the landowner, the tenant, or a neighboring landowner or tenant comes up to me and stops me and asks me what I'm doing. And let me tell you, first thing, passion for Ply Lake conservation really resonates with landowners. Passion is contagious, enthusiasm is contagious, and you can talk to them about what you're seeing out there. And honestly, there are 3 things that, in my experiences, that gets landowners excited. And that's water for future generations, money that's going to help their bottom line, and or wildlife. And Ply Lake conservation covers all 3 of those things. So if you can get a landowner's ear and talking about one of those 3 things and get them into a a program that restores their playa lake, then they're gonna soon follow or appreciate the other two. So a lot of the landowners I've worked with in the past were really concerned about bottom lines, but after learning and understanding how playa lakes work, they're seeing that it's, benefiting future generations of their family with water, and seeing direct benefits to the wildlife that they have on the land that they're working on. So if you can get them with one, the other two will shortly follow. Other conversations when it comes to playa lake conservation, it's always brought up is, are these landowners looking for a short versus long-term solution? How flexible is the landowner with these programs? Are they willing to kind of take away some of their private property ownership rights or want to keep those? And that always falls into if they're interested in federal versus state or non-government programs. So what I do, like I said, I follow the rain. I try to catch these landowners that are looking at their fields that are flooded. We're looking at the same thing, but trying to put a spin on it like, hey, this is a positive thing. You should really enjoy this and share that passion, that excitement of why those things are so important. But being in an area that's semi-arid, we have to use other things to reach out to these private landowners, which are some of those maps that Christopher talked about earlier today. PLJV has a great data set and interactive maps that shows where playas can potentially be located. And I highly suggest everyone to go to the Playa Lake website. But when I'm working with landowners, when we're in a drought, it's harder to tell where those playa lakes are located, and it takes a special eye to see it. But for the majority of the landowners, they know that it's out there and they can tell you the problems. But when it comes to a field office, it's not always the same case, whether that's a employee being from out of state or not familiar with the region. It takes a special eye sometimes to see where these playa lakes are located. And these tools that Playa Lake Joint Venture has out there really, really does help out our field staff or other staff understand where that potential might be. Not only location, but also gives you an idea of how much water is being recharged to the aquifer, as well as the likelihood of these areas being wet during a certain time of year, which has been super duper handy for those who like to waterfowl hunt. So you can really target those areas that are a little bit wetter in the fall. Another big tool that we use here in Kansas is made by the Kansas Biological Survey, which is the wetland or the Western Kansas wetland layer. There are several wetlands in eastern Colorado that shows up on this map, but not all of them. But this was developed by KBS that helps us see some of those wetland areas that don't show up on the PLJV layer. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but there are several hundred playas that do not show up on the Playa Lake Joint Venture layer, but shows up on this layer. And the other cool thing about this interactive map that KBS has created, you get to see where the water is coming from. So those watersheds that Christopher was talking about are a option to overlay on this layer too. So you can really pinpoint where a lot of the sediment may be coming in and where you might want to put a larger buffer when it comes to restoration to apply. The other big part of where we've had success with playa restoration and conservation is working with our partners. Hands down, our FSA and NRCS staff are amazing. They're familiar with each other's programs, not to be, they're not directing anyone to any one specific program, but if a landowner has a playa, when they're coming in and certifying wheat, the FSA employees have an idea of, hey, there are options out there for you outside of farming these things and or losing money in these areas. A lot of these landowners here in Western Kansas and all across the High Plains see these as a money sink. But let's just face it, human nature is we live in highs and lows, the best times and worst of times, and that's the times that you remember. And honestly, talking to several hundred different landowners, if not thousands, a lot of the time it's worse at times. But when you talk about taking ground out of production, putting it into conservation, they want to tell you about the best times. Like that's the only place that I got any type of wheat harvest off of there, or that's the only place I got any milo off of there because we were in such a severe drought. So that partnership with FSA and NRCS of understanding each other's programs has been huge. And our local FSA office has been very good with working with producers when they're certifying wheat to talk to them about Playa Lake conservation and some of the programs that are out there, at least through the FSA shop and also the NRCS shop. So some of the programs that have been very successful out here in Western Kansas are the CP23A non-floodplain wetland restoration, but more importantly is the CP38B migratory bird, butterfly, and pollinator safe. I won't go too into the details about this, but both of these programs have been very, very successful here in Western Kansas. CP38B, CP23A is your typical continuous program, which I won't dive into it a whole bunch, but it is meant for non-floodplain restoration areas, such as the areas that we're talking about here on the High Plains. But the program or practice that has really, had a ton of success here in Western Kansas is the CP38B butterfly and pollinator safe. The reason why this practice has been so successful is one, our NRCS and our FSA staff have been trained very heavily on how this program or practice works. The other reason why this has been so successful is because it's a little bit different than your typical CRP. The landowner gets to tell FSA how much it's going to take my ground out of production, so this Playa area plus a buffer out of production and put in conservation, up to the county's NAS irrigation rates. Other than that, it's very similar to your typical CRP payments and practices, the continuous practices. So how successful this program has been? Well, over the last 5 years, we've seen over 13,000 acres get into that program. Outside of grassland CRP, this is probably the most successful CRP practice that we've seen in the High Plains in several decades. So to our best estimate, we're conserving about 4,000 acres of playas and a little over 9,000 acres of uplands. So a little over a 1-to-2 ratio, which is really, really cool when it comes to wetland conservation and wetland conservation here in the High Plains. And I will say that this program alone has restored, conserved, and enhanced and helped manage more Playa Lake wetland acres in the first 5 years of this practice than we have the previous 25 years. So just to kind of keep that in perspective of how important this program is to Playa Lake conservation. The other part of working with private landowners is private landowners understand partnerships between a landowner and USDA, but they are always looking at trying to stack different programs. So we also have a great partnership with our Game and Parks department here in Kansas. They have programs out there that are able to stack on top of these rental payments when it comes to public access. If a landowner is willing to get into 38B or CRP or grassland CRP, they have the option to get into a lease agreement with the state of Kansas to provide public access for hunters during the hunting season. That's all negotiable. These are short-term leases, 1 to 3 years, that wildlife and parks and the landowner get to work on. And so far, it's been a huge success story of being able to stack those programs. But other programs that we like to stack are our Ducks Unlimited programs and our cost initiatives or incentives to landowners to restore Playa Lakes here in western Kansas. Some of the stuff that we help pay for are those incentive payments go along the lines of helping landowners do dirt work, cover crops, native grass establishment, and also fencing. And that's just a few of the things that we do here in western Kansas that help landowners get into a CRP program and or a NRCS program. Just for an example to show how much Ducks Unlimited is interested in Playa Lake conservation, here in western Kansas, I've worked with over 100 different landowners and tenants to help them out with $1.2 million of out-of-pocket costs to help restore, protect, conserve, and manage over 12,000 acres of Playa Lakes and associated wetlands. And this number is actually growing. I think we just got done with another 1,200 acres here this last month. So this number is continuously growing, and we're obviously working on trying to get more in the door, not only here in the state of Kansas, but Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, and obviously Colorado and New Mexico. So if when worst comes to worst, you're using, all these different tools that you have in your hands to, work with these PLJV maps, working with partners. But honestly, if you can't catch a landowner when it rains, a cold call goes miles with it. I had the opportunity about 6 years ago, actually 7 years ago, start with DU, and it was a goal of mine to try to cold call at least one landowner every day. And I did that for my first 6 months. Those cold calls go a long way, and it is a learning curve. It's very uncomfortable when you start doing it, but as soon as you start getting your rhythm and you learn how to do it, it's a lot easier. And I highly suggest any young biologist who's getting in this field to work on cold calling and working that trait into your repertoire. So I hope that you guys can see that, or I hope you guys were able to take away a better understanding of who DU is, where we work, how our model here in Kansas works with communication with not only the landowner, but also our partners, and why we've had success here in the last several years of Kansas. And I'd like to end on, all of us on this phone call are sharing common goals. And that's the reason why Kansas has had such great success, because there's so many common goals that we all work together for. We just got to find a way to achieve those goals. And I think that through all these partnerships and communication, it's easy to do. So with that, I hope I didn't go over my time too much, but that will end my presentation. So any questions?
Thanks, Abe. And I'll say Katie's going to pick up a little bit more on the landowner piece as well. So Abe, if you're able to hang out for another, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, so folks have questions after Katie's portion, can we do those together?
Sure thing. Yeah.
All righty. Thank you. Katie, do you want me to share my screen, or do you want to share yours?
I can get it. That'll work.
You do it?
Yep. If you will watch the chat for me.
Yes, I gotcha.
Sweet. Okay, let me know when you are seeing my screen.
We can see it. It's just not in presentation mode yet.
Okay. Sweet.
Perfect.
All right, so I'm just gonna touch base a little bit more detail on the producer side of it. So we've talked already about what an ideal playa looks like, and what those three items that Abe brought up: water, money, and wildlife concerns. So I just want to kind of zoom in on the different contexts that you're looking at for incorporation of stuff, because the context is going to change a lot of what the discussion you're having with the landowner is and what they want out of their playa. So the two big ones I want to focus in on are cropland and rangeland, because the playas are used so differently between them, and they mean such radically different things for the landowners on those pieces of property. So starting with cropland, I'm going to make you all wake up a little bit here and chime in. If you've ever been out on the property with a landowner, what have they said about a playa? What is a guy who's raising wheat or a guy who is irrigating corn? What are they saying about a playa? What does it mean to them? What's its costs? What's its benefits? Name anything. Shoot it in the chat. And just to reinforce this, I will not move on until I get at least one thing in the chat. So just for fun.
I'm keeping an eye on the chat for you, Katie.
Okay, thank you. Be short or long. Some people think about it in long-term benefits. Some people think about it short-term costs or annoyances.
So we're getting, somebody said most productive land. Somebody said a mud hole, wet area where my cash crops suffer. Birds, buffalo wallow. So there you go. You got 5.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
I think what's interesting to me about the cropland, especially, is that right there we have 5 and 2 of them conflict with each other. One of them says it's where your cash crops suffer, and one of them says it's where your best crops are. And it goes back a little bit to what Abe was saying about the drought years. We've been in 20 years of drought, and that changes the way people feel about playas.
And then you've got that sorry, Katie, to cut you off, but we got one more comment in there that says good on dry years, bad in wet years.
There you go. It's a peak valley, right? It's the best of the best and it's the worst of the worst. So these are the things I'm pulling in, right? Hazardous to equipment, somebody who mentioned mud holes. You can get tractors stuck in here. It's hard. You have to work at it, to be sure, but you can do it. People think of them as lost land. It's wasted water. Why is all this water sitting in a pool on my field when it should be feeding my crops? And going back to Andy's conversation about soils, these are just really sort of poor soils. In general, short of a really dry year, they're not doing as well as the rest of those acres. This isn't nice, loamy soil that's absorbing water and really works well year after year. It's a clay soil that plants have trouble sending roots through. When it's wet, it floods out your plants. So Abe showed us some photos of a crop field with a playa in it, and there's crops all around that playa, and then it is dead dirt and water inside the playa. So that is just a waste of seed right there. Irregular tillage. Any of you guys ever looked at historic photos of landscapes? You'll see that some of these playas have really interesting tillage histories where for a couple of years, folks will try to plow straight through them, just line there, line back, cover it up, pretend like it's not there. 10 years later, they're trying a different strategy. They're tilling around that. They're doing like a little quarter circle thing specific for this and then looping around the playa. It causes issues in terms of a natural tillage system because you're faced with either having erosion concerns or having trouble running through it over these dips and rills and things, or fighting against it and covering areas more than one time, really. And these are the big things that I think of that you want to kind of come in with to talk to a landowner. So a landowner is going to feel different things. One of them is going to tell you it's his best land. One of them is going to tell you it's his worst productive land. These are the points where you have to know exactly where your specific landowner is coming from. How do they feel about it specifically? And where on this can you find a pressure point, if you will? I'm making it sound like we're going to manipulate landowners, but it's a little bit more like salesmanship, right? We want to conserve this, and there are reasons that playas are unique from the rest of cropland. There are very good reasons why you can convince people not to treat them like the rest of their cropland. So these are the ones that I want to focus in on. One thing to always remember though, profit margins I have on top, right? That's that money piece. I often find though that people aren't necessarily rational about their decision making, especially where land is concerned. So making a profit argument when what they're really concerned about is pride in their operation, they just don't want to lose that land where they're focusing so heavily on lost land. Your argument's not really going to make a dent, right? So I think to hammer home what Abe mentioned, passion really goes a long way. Passion and pride in their place, and alternatively, sort of like fear and shame about if they gave up this land. So sort of realizing what those emotional pieces of it are and incorporating that, because that's going to be where you are able to make an argument about these things with regards to that specific landowner. Okay, so those are our general context for cropland. For rangeland, what do your guys say? If you go out there, they have a playa. What are they using it for? Why do they want it? Why do they dislike it? How does it make their days better, worse? In between, do they care at all?
Somebody put in water for livestock,
It's a big one.
best grass for cattle,
Okay. Anything else? Those are the two big ones, I think, but
I'll let you know if another one pops up, Katie.
okay. Yeah, so in this case, it's not as much about what's growing in there, right?
You
The
got
water-
a wildlife abundance. Somebody popped in wildlife.
Wildlife. Thank you.
Yep.
Ranchers in particular tend to be a little bit more wildlife friendly on a day-to-day basis. Cropland guys like to build that in intentionally, which is nice. So I think those are the big ones. Water sources is huge. In ranching systems, these are often dug out for cattle ponds. So if you have an area that doesn't have a water source, period, they will often be using these playas as a water source. And they'll be concerned about wells. So some wells in our area are slowly going drier. What does the playa mean for them relative to slowly drying wells? And they may not have made that connection yet. You can make it for them. A lot of folks will talk about evaporation, talk about pooling that water together so that it doesn't evaporate. Like if it's all fairly shallow across the surface, there's this impression that they're just contributing to evaporation. That water is going to waste if it's being evaporated. But there can be other areas. So somebody mentioned the forage. A lot of people in dry years, this is where the water comes to rest. This is where the best vegetation is. And again, this is a peak valley system though, right? So if it's a wet year, your best vegetation is nowhere near your playa. This is all wet, soggy, and this is a case where it can become hazardous to livestock. So I know a few folks who have told stories about calves who get stuck out there, walk out for a drink of water in the middle of something and get stuck in the mud and cannot move. It doesn't happen very often, but it is a concern for folks where every lost animal is a lost part of their income. And then that wildlife piece is something to always bring in and incorporate. A lot of people, especially in ranchland, are selling hunting rights. So are they hunting ducks? Are they hunting antelope who might use this briefly? Are they hunting lesser prairie chickens who are nowhere, not less greater prairie chickens, forgive me, or nowhere near this? What specific thing can you hone in on here? And the water is the biggest one, right? I find for ranchers, you have to solve the water problem first. So water money, wildlife, water has to be solved first for ranchers. So if it is their only source of water, that leads you into what do I need to do to make this an effective transition for them? So you need to add a new water source. And that can be something that a lot of folks are really interested in, actually. Because let's be honest, we saw the pictures in Christopher's presentation. Those cattle ponds are not high quality water. They're concentration points. There's no cycling. It sits there. They step in it. They wander around it. They're doing all sorts of things in it, right? It's not high quality water and it's not reliable water. So transitioning to a well or to a water tank is often something that they're on board for if they can get that money to do it. And then just that well piece of it. If they do have another water source, encouraging them to recognize the value of the playa as a restored playa, supporting their other better water sources, getting that infiltration, building on this. So I think these are the real key points where you want to focus in and figure out what their driving factor is so that you can work around it. You can tailor your arguments towards it. And water is a big source of fear on these rangeland systems. So that's the two different sort of contexts I want to incorporate here. So let's take a look at what it means for restoration though. Anytime I think you're going in with a landowner, you absolutely need to be honest about what the costs and benefits are. So what does it mean for the landowner to restore a playa on cropland? Christopher mentioned that it is a stable system, right? It's covered, it's not disturbed, and it has no sedimentation. All of this means that in cropland, what you're looking for is you're really taking this land out of production, period. So you have to be honest about that from the start. You can have really, really great conversations with folks about the pros and cons, about the benefits, about the costs. You can do all this as long as you're being honest up front. Because they need to know what the monetary value is. This is where you start getting into nitty-gritty money details. And if you're honest about it, they can work through that and find the benefits for them. If you're not honest about it, it causes problems from the start. So include that they're going to lose that income. But I think we're honestly at a really sort of encouraging point in terms of cropland where there's so many opportunities with precision farming that folks for themselves are discovering where their best acreages are. So it's a good moment to work with folks, especially who are doing this sort of intense stuff, to discuss, okay, if you've got this area where you're having high inputs, you are using lots of diesel on it every year, you're getting less crop off it every year, and there is this alternative program. We can just take out these acres. Let's use these acres for a different way that will make you proud of these acres. Let's incorporate it into a different paradigm and work on it from that angle. And then, of course, the irrigation recharge is also pivotal, right? The Ogallala is going down. A lot of you may be up in that area where some of them are having to turn off wells. And that's a real loss in terms of what they've been doing for years and years. So using this as a way to help them continue their business model can be a really easy way to their persuasion points. And then rangeland. Being honest here means that they might lose that water source, means that they might have to forego some grazing. How are they grazing this place? Is it grazed so hard that it is causing sedimentation issues? That might be a concern. Is it struggling with just weird seasonal grazing where it's always used as the calving pasture, and that causes issues with the rain cycles? There are very real transitions they might have to make in terms of the way that they organize their cattle. And these are generally fairly work throughable. You have to know where the landowner is coming. You have to recognize what their system is so that you can work within it. And then just the win here, of course, is rainfall storage. I know a lot of folks especially in the holistic community, talk about how much rainfall they captured, right? So I got 12 inches of rain, whereas my neighbor, who also had 12 inches of rainfall, only caught 4 inches. It can be a really big boon to think about, where is this water going? What happens once you catch this water? So those are the things that you want to, honest costs you want to bring up to landowners. And then really find the benefit that works for them. So wildlife is a huge benefit. Lots of people love wildlife, and they may not tell you this at front glance, right? Or their wife may really like, or husband may, the person who's not the front model for the market may be the one to get involved in this. And that feels a little bit like cheating, but usually these are family businesses, and the person you're working with may not be the only person who has a say. And these different perspectives are all critical for moving forward on a plan. Pollinators are big for farmers. Reinforce that this is something that can benefit them, especially in a system where we have lost some of that ability. Vegetable farmers are hugely open to this sort of argument, especially, but everybody really needs more pollinators to get stuff going. Aquifers, we talked about a little bit. Soil moisture, in a bigger sense, if you're keeping that water on site and it's reaching the edge of this aquifer, it's going sideways through your soil. It's really helping with your moisture long term. And then just filtering and that forage source component that we talked about. Just an encouragement to find their specific point. And I always like to mention the wildlife because I am a wildlife biologist, but everybody actually loves to see ducks. They really do. Even if they're not going to spend money to see them, once they see them, they'll want them to come back. So use that to your advantage. And I know I am just at time, so I want to open it up to any questions or comments about what you guys think works, which don't think works, and how we can work better with landowners on this piece.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Abe, both of you for speaking about the landowner piece. So yeah, let's do questions. I think we've got some time. We gave ourselves a buffer, so we've got time for questions on this one.
Oh, Tavin has a hand up.
Hey Katie, this is Tavin. Hey, you mentioned kind of working that dynamic with cattle ranching, and what are some of those options that you usually offer the landowner and for that alternative water source, and kind of how do you go about just going through that kind of situation? Thanks.
Yeah, it varies on location. Obviously, the best option is usually a new well, and a new water tank. Now there are areas in Colorado where new wells have become almost undoable. There are very few water witchers, and otherwise the aquifers are so far down you can't reach them. So that's not always a possibility for everyone. But the fact is, most folks have some water somewhere, right? So we can also work on increasing storage. If the issue is your well is just not great anymore, let's make sure that you're having enough to store through the bad days, until it can start producing again. Let's work on really that rainfall capture stuff. So really sort of emphasizing to them, and then we can pipe it anywhere. At one point, our soil scientist said to me that a mile of pipe is 100 foot of well. So if you're going to have to go down 600 feet for water, it's probably cheaper if you have water anywhere within 6 miles to pipe that over. Obviously that's going to vary a whole heck of a lot, but just to put stuff in context, piping stuff over is very cost intensive, heavy on the front end, but it'll reap lots of benefits for landowners. They will be very grateful for that sort of assistance. and they'd be willing to give up a playa for it. So take them up on it. Ted has a question.
Yeah, I wonder if you or and Abe as well can weigh in on this, have looked into programs. We've tried to we've implemented a few here in Nebraska where we actually retire or restore the playa, but allow the landowner to retain the cropping rights. We've done a few of those through ale, because the intent is we want the hydrology restored. We obviously don't want the sediment in there. That can be an issue with that approach, but just any thoughts on that? And part of it is as you get further east, especially into central Nebraska, we have a lot of reed canary grass and tree issues. And if you just set something aside in one of the USDA long-term programs, it grows up to those invasives. So we're trying to figure out how do you have the benefit of that playa, the water, the wildlife benefit, but still allow the farmer to have that, make that decision. Some of them switch over and run cattle on it, but some could gamble and say, looks like a dry year, I'm gonna try to, dish through it and try to get a crop this year, and that's allowable. So don't know if you've thought about that approach or.
I have not. I don't know that that's something we've done in Colorado, but it might be something to look into.
So Ted, I think that's where cover crops may come into play, kind of like what's happening up in the Dakotas, where they're implementing cover crops, especially in the rainwater basin to stop some of that sedimentation, but also have the opportunity to graze and potentially to get a crop in it at least maybe once every 5 years. So, I mean, there's
Cover
that
crop in the
opportunity.
uplands, and you're thinking, so yeah.
Out in western, well, you know this, Ted, as well as I do, but western Kansas, eastern Colorado isn't the most ideal setting for cover crops. Our producers haven't had very much success, and honestly, our producers are a little bit more interested in grass than more of a longer term fix versus an annual input that they may or may not see returns on.
Yeah, I mean, ideally we would transition them to grass, and just because, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of easier to work with the ranchers from that water grass perspective. But we deal with some hardcore farmers who just want to farm, right? And they don't, small area, they don't have cattle, they don't want to mess with it, so they would just let it be idle then if they enroll it in a program. And then again, where you have reed canary and things, it becomes an issue. So yeah. Thank you.
And to go back to Tavin's question, maybe kind of piggybacking on that, and Katie, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I would assume that EQIP has some funding opportunity to offset some of those costs. So if watering is an issue on a rangeland situation, EQIP could be a potential watering cost share source. And I don't want to speak for Kansas or Colorado Ducks Unlimited, but there might be some potential funding outside of EQIP, whether that's through the state and or NGO organizations.
Yeah, EQIP is always available for that sort of thing. It is competitive, of course, but as part of a larger wildlife project, it often stands a better chance of getting funded. So
is CSP an option as well for that in Colorado?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
We got a question in the chat. Is there a concern that playa restoration may result in losing significantly more cropped land in wet years?
Good question, Christine. I suspect that probably some landowners might see it that way. I don't know, Abe, if you've seen folks discussing that. My rebuttal to that would be that you are losing cropland for sure, but you're unlikely to lose more cropland in wet years if you have a buffer zone and a functional playa than if you just have a non-functional playa that with no buffer at all, where it's not capturing that sediment. Where if you have a really wet year and you have buffered that out 30 meters beyond the extent of the playa, ideally you kind of know where that water is going to go. You know exactly where it's going to end and where it's going to seep in, so that it's not getting any more onto your cropland than a flood just normally does on a non-playa system, right? So you can kind of predict it better. Whereas if you are not restoring that playa at all, and you don't perhaps even know where the extent of it is, all of that is lost crop. Abe, you want to jump in on that?
No, I'll just echo what you say, like, you know, what you said previously, those inputs, if you're farming through apply, those inputs are gonna double, if not triple over time. And if you take those areas out of production, you have a better idea of, staying away from those areas when it comes to burying tractors and combines, which we've seen several different times in these areas. But I would not see that there is more cropland loss when it comes to Playa Lake restoration. I'm guessing that question derives from, getting more water into the playa and restoring that hydrology. So there might be more water coming into that basin area. I'm assuming that's what it is in regards to, but I think Katie hit the head on the nail. Like if you have that buffer area, you have that quote unquote buffer to flood that fluctuates in and out, which would be, I would hope in the planning sessions would be large enough to withstand 100-year flood.
And I actually put the PLGV by land use calculator in the chat, and that's a really good tool. I haven't used it much personally, but it's very
Super handy.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley, for throwing that in there. Any other questions for Katie or Abe? Yes, Dominic.
Abe, can you discuss like insurance and APHs at all? What restoring playas and taking that out of their production would mean for producers as part of the conversation with them?
I have not gotten into those conversations with producers, and the whole insurance game when it comes to crop insurance, I am not well adversed with. I don't know how much of an effect it has with producers, but I would assume that their insurance companies, knowing that their least productive acres that they might be claiming for being taken out of production and put into something that's a little bit more viable, is something they would appreciate from an insurance standpoint. But I don't know how many landowners in western Kansas or eastern Colorado are farming for insurance. They're farming because they want to farm and want to do what's best for the resource. So I wish I could give you a better answer, Dominic, but I don't have a good one. Katie, you got anything on that?
I think your last point is most important. I think you want to work with the folks who are most interested in being good stewards here. If you can just convince them that that looks like playa restoration. Otherwise, I think you might make short-term gains, but if there's a better thing down the road, they're always just going to go for that better thing anyway. So,
Well, I'm going to unfortunately stop this discussion, but if other questions come up, please put them in the chat, and we'll just ask Katie and Abe to keep an eye on the chat and respond, as questions come up if they're directed to you. So we did have a break scheduled between this session and our last one. We are aiming to be done by 2:30 at the latest today. We have kind of a buffer in there. If folks want to skip the break, give me a thumbs up emoji. Or if you want 4 or 5 minutes to run to the restroom. So thumbs up emoji if you want to skip the break. I'm getting a good number of them. Alrighty, I think I'm getting enough of them to say let's skip the break. So I'm going to turn it over to Patty and Dominic to talk about our final session restoration. And then, as I say, we'll have a good amount of time for discussion and questions at the end after Patty and Dominic's presentation. Patty, we can see your screen. So all set on that. But I think,
Hello.
great, there
Sorry.
you are. Perfect.
This is Dominic Pinalto. I'm an easement specialist in Kansas working for NRCS, and I recently switched over to the stewardship side to take care of playas after they've been restored. My experience is working on playa restorations for the ASEP WRE, so the Agricultural Easement Program. Wetland restoration easements is where my background comes from. Patty, if you can change the slide for me, please. Here, we're going to talk about the cropland playa restoration. To me, what you're looking at here is an ideal, when we're done with restoration, what it should look like. Grass in the foreground, there's areas of forbs out there. Clear out in the very far background is the playa itself. This is kind of what we look for in Kansas as our ideal restoration and what it should look like when we're all said and done. So I want you to kind of get that in your mind as we go forward here. Next slide, please. And I know people have talked about planning. I'm going to talk about planning again as part of the restoration because the one thing we cannot mess up is the planning stage. If we take our time and we plan this, do this as a team effort, so we get all parties that are involved or all parties that have some interest in the playa restoration. So that could be NRCS, it could be the landowner has to be part of this, the Bird Conservancy, PLJV, Ducks Unlimited, state wildlife agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, or any other partners that have an interest in playas in your area. Bring them all on board. They all offer a unique aspect or a unique vision of what needs to happen with these playas and how to restore them properly. And they help with that planning process and putting it together correctly so we get it right. We have to get it right the very first time. Next slide, please. So some of the common practices we see in engineering are going to be wetland restoration, land smoothing, well decommissioning, obstruction removal, upland practices, cover crops, range planting, brush management, and herbaceous weed treatment. I will go into detail on each one of these here in the next few slides. So next slide, please. In engineering, 657 is a common practice that we use in NRCS. It is a sediment removal. We do not remove sediment across the entire playa basin. We only remove sediment that is greater than 4 inches. The reason why we do this, it allows us to restore the playa back to as close as possible functioning without sediment in it, but also limits our possibility of puncturing the clay lens. That's a real threat or perceived threat, is puncturing through the bottom of it. We also, when we remove that sediment, we have to remove that sediment from the playa, and we remove that sediment at least 120 feet from the annulus, and spread it no more than 8 inches thick. That goes back to kind of like what Chris had spoke to from PLJV about getting it away from that playa and giving it a good buffer so that sediment doesn't end right back up in that playa. The reason why we spread it no more than 8 inches thick is to allow the water to naturally flow back into the playa without impeding flow from water. Another thing that we do very commonly is precision land smoothing. So that'll be leveling of terraces or breaking of terraces. I know earlier they said to break terraces, we can have channeling. If we're going to break terraces and it's shown that there's going to be enough water flow that we will create channeling, we will then do waterways to help put that water down into the playa so that it flows naturally down in there. And we have two different types of terraces we deal with out west. One is a gradient terrace, which has a slope to it. So they will slope usually to a waterway, and then that waterway will take the water down to the lowest point or off the surface. Or we have level terraces, which actually act as small dams and hold the water up on the landscape. And so we will smooth the level terraces out or break them. And if the gradient terraces actually go away from the playa, we will actually change that and get it to coming back into the playa or break them so the water will go down to the playa. The 4-inch mark is anything above 4 inches. It comes from our engineers, and I believe work with, there was a question in the chat, sorry. Our engineers and working with PLJV and scientists, that anything above 4 inches of sediment, the playa can't naturally get that sediment out of its basin on its own. Next slide, please. Some of the other engineering practices we use are well decommissioning. As you have spoke about in Colorado and on pastures, there were wells. Playas make a great place to put a well because there's always a water source underneath them. There seems to be a water source underneath them. So we will actually plug those wells and fill them. They can be livestock wells, irrigation wells. We've ran into domestic wells. Across western Kansas, that's something that we find very often are wells either in the basin of the playa or just off of the edge of the playa. So we actually do quite a bit of well decommissioning while we're restoring these playas. And in obstruction removal, the removal of fences, trees, structures, old fence lines create barriers. I apologize, I lost my screen.
Okay, good. Yeah, we lost you for a minute, so you
I
can just.
apologize. Yeah, the whole thing went down. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Well, good. I thought it was my sound as well, but everybody lost sound just for a second. So as soon as you get your screen back up,
Yep, I'm back up.
sweet.
I don't know where you lost me at.
About 30 seconds ago. So
Okay, so about like fence removal.
You were talking, yes, about fence removal.
Okay,
yeah.
so fences will create a barrier from time. The dirt blowing into the fence lines, they will actually act as a terrace and keep water from getting to playas, or they will separate playas in two, and so you only have water on one side of the playa and not the other side. So we do a lot of fence removal and tree removal and structures as well that are built on or around the playas that keep water from making it down to the playas. Next slide, please. Other practices that we use for engineering on cropland playa restoration are grassed waterways. Like I said, to when we break a terrace, to actually put in a grassed waterway to allow that water to flow down into the playa. Sometimes you have terraces that lead the water off of the easement or away from the playa, and we'll put waterways in and divert those terraces into the waterway so that we can get as much water as we can down into those playas. Diversions 362. We've used those to divert water actually towards the playa, where if you have a land feature that is diverting the water away from the playa that is on the property, you can put a diversion in there and direct the water towards the playa. Also, diversions are used to keep water from going on to neighboring property. Sometimes, neighbors get upset that we get more water on there than what they're used to having. Once they're restored and getting all that water coming into the playa, so we'll have to put a diversion up to keep some of the water from backing up onto a neighbor's property. 659 is wetland enhancement. It's used less frequently than 657, the restoration, but we use it for sediment removal as well. The big thing we use it for is ditch plugging. So a lot of you are aware that these playas have been ditched to drain them in the past, and attempts to drain them or other methods to try to drain them. So we will use the ditch plugging to plug that and help keep the water from being drained off of the playa as we restore it and back it up. Next slide, please. And then we go into our ecological practices, ecological science practices. I commonly call these our upland acres or our buffer area. We usually will start out after all of the sediments removed, all of the engineering and all of the dirt work is done. We go to putting in cover crops. Typical cover crops in western Kansas, I would assume it would be the same as for eastern Colorado and Nebraska, would be a forage sorghum or a grain sorghum or triticale. We really like forage sorghum planted in the spring because it's going to grow up tall. It's going to give really good cover for wildlife and birds. And it's also going to give us a great weed suppression for those native grasses and forbs that we'll be planting later on. Usually plant the cover crop. It needs to be 24 inches tall. If it's not, then we have to go through it again. Some things that we try not to use is rye. Rye is one thing that we do not use as a cover crop, at least in the state of Kansas. The reason why is it has an allelopathic effect on small seeded forbs. So our forbs that we like to see, all the wildflowers, things like that, the rye will actually hinder the growth and germination of those forbs. We can use wheat, but we try to typically not use winter wheat in our cover crop because wheat breaks down so fast that it doesn't give us a good long-term cover and give the protection and weed suppression that we need to establish our grasses and our forbs for that native mix. Next slide, please. This here is a cover crop. And when you look at the picture, you go, wow, that is a beautiful cover crop. Let's certify that, and we go down the road. The problem with this picture is that the forage sorghum you see, the taller green plants you see growing in that was actually supposed to be our cover crop. The rest of the green in there is volunteer wheat and weeds. This was a planted cover crop due to an extremely dry year in that area. That was taken this summer, matter of fact, in that area. It was extremely dry, and you can see we didn't get enough of a cover crop to actually do what we needed. So again, being very vigilant, going back and checking on everything that we're doing and making sure that it's right is necessary to have a fully restored playa that's functioning how we want it later on in life. And that's why I wanted to include this, was just to give you an idea of, sometimes we succeed and sometimes we fail. And when we fail, it's not a true failure. We turn around and we go on and do it all again. Next slide, please. And so after we've planted a cover crop and we've got a good establishment of a cover crop, we go back in with a range planting. The range plantings that we do in western half of Kansas in the Playas, I've got to give props to Playa Lakes Joint Venture, Ducks Unlimited, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, and our own biologist. They all sat down at a table. From what I understand, this was way before my time. Abe was involved in this, and I think Matt Smith was involved in this, and they came up with a unbelievably good Playa Lake, what we call it the Playa Lakes mix. It's full of forbs and grasses. It follows the ecological site descriptions of what was in the area before, and allows us to have a very diverse mix that's great for wildlife. It gives us that sediment control. It takes out the large debris and sediment that's headed to the playa and filter out that before it gets actually to the playa bottom. And so again, work with your partners and come up with a really good grass mix and forb mix that is for the area. And the biggest thing is to come up with something and not be afraid to tweak it a little bit as need be for each one, and to work with partners on this. Next slide, please. And brush management. We have playas and areas that, nice thing about a playa is a lot of times that's where the most water is on the area in the area. As you can see in the background picture there, I have a foiler half hidden behind cedar trees. I know everybody on this call loves cedar trees as much as I do. And so brush management is a great way to cut those out of there, and treat, and it could be cedars, it can be locust trees, but we need to be able to get those all taken out and removed. And so we use brush management 314 to do that. 315 herbaceous weed treatment allows for the establishment of the native plant community. It can be mechanical, disking, or chemical. When we restore a playa, we'll usually have some type of a mechanical or chemical herbaceous weed treatment before the planting of a cover crop. Once our cover crop is established and we get we do not do any chemical after that usually, because of our mix is so forb heavy that chemicals will kill the forbs that we plant. Usually after we've done our 550, our range planting, we will come back in sometimes with a mechanical mowing of the easement area. We're very limited how much we do of that, just because our forbs, some of them are only annuals, and the annuals need to go to seed. So it's a judgment call on how much weed treatment that you do, and it takes vicious monitoring and watching of the property to make sure that we get that right. Another practice that we would like to use more of, and it's finally starting to catch on with a lot of working with landowners and knowledge, and just basically planting the seed, is prescribed burning. Prescribed burning is a great resource. If you've already got grass or natives out there, you can burn it, reinvigorate them, get rid of some of the non-natives or the invasive species. But prescribed burning in western Kansas, I'm assuming it's the same way in the other playa regions, has not caught on as much as it has in the eastern part of Kansas. But it is slowly taking effect, and with a lot of partners going out and educating the public about it, it's becoming more and more common. Next slide, please. And this leads us to Patty. Any questions on the cropland side? Or Patty, do you want to wait until you're done with yours and we just take them all at once?
Either way, what do you want
Yeah.
to do, Anna?
I think let's do them all at once. If that's all right with you, Dominic, and if folks
Perfect.
have questions in the meantime, we can throw them in the chat.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, everybody. This is Patty Knapp, area biologist with NRCS in Colorado. And when I was a partner biologist eons ago, more than 10 years ago, I was doing rangeland playa restoration. And I feel like after this morning that more attention is given to farmed or cropland playas, probably because they're more endangered and are going to become fossils. However, there are numerous rangeland playas that also need restoration. And some of these things you've already heard before, but this will be a good reminder for you. So why is rangeland playa restoration needed? Because of altered hydrology, and most oftentimes with rangeland playas, we're dealing with pits and roads that traverse watersheds. In addition, this is something that wasn't really mentioned that much this morning, but the rangeland playas that I have seen tend to be overgrazed just because they do have more lush vegetation in certain years, and the water attracts the livestock to them. In addition, because of the sometimes better moisture that the playa areas receive, there are some landowners that actually hay their playa lakes. And because of that, there's limited vegetation for invertebrates and seed production for protein for migrating waterfowl and shorebirds. You saw this slide in Dominic's presentation, and others talked about planning earlier today, but bottom line is good projects begin with good planning. And coming from a NRCS background, we always identify what our resource concerns are, and we have to have resource concerns that can be addressed. And for playa restoration, the resource concerns that we would be using would be aquatic habitat for fish and other organisms, and or terrestrial habitat for wildlife and invertebrates. So playa restoration starts with a site visit and evaluation with the landowners and all the partners on site at one time. In Colorado, we use this assessment, the Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide, or WEG for playas. I don't know how many other states have a type of evaluation guide like this, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through this. And this was from 2010. However, I don't think many things have changed, but the general information for the purposes of using this model, playas are depressional wetland habitats found in the eastern plains of Colorado that are the terminus of a closed basin watershed. Playas are characterized by their round shape, shallow depth, and ephemeral hydrology. We've heard all this morning. Playas can range from less than in size, from less than an acre to greater than 80 acres in size. Intact playas in Colorado may exhibit wetland plant communities or rangeland plant communities, depending upon the recent flooding history. Most playas in the state have been altered through cultivation or modifications to their hydrology. The following model should only be used in eastern Colorado. And this model was developed based on an interim functional assessment model for depressional wetlands. So let's take a look at the different factors that we assess. And the way these WEGs work, or these wildlife habitat evaluation guides, is when we go on site, we determine what the benchmark condition is, and that would be the before condition. And for our first factor, hydrology, the best condition would be that there are no excavations or modifications. And the worst in this case, I'm not going to go through all these, is that any condition that is less than A or B. And in the scenario that I'm going to show you next, in a couple of pictures later, this is a playa that I recently visited with Kelsey Holloway, or Kelsey Mock, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partners. And the particular playa we were looking at, it had excavations, and it also had road that was traversing the watershed. And so I gave this a score of 0. And I feel after we implement our plan that we're going to come up with, that we should be able to bring that score up and improve that to a 1, where there will be no excavations, constructed outlets, roads within the playa basin. Second hydrology factor is the best is in that it's completely intact, that the watershed is, and the worst is that it's highly eroded. And I gave this particular wetland that we went to look at a 0.25, that it was a little bit dysfunctional because there was some erosion coming into the wetland as well, or the playa as well. And I should have mentioned too that this WEG is used for both cropland playas and rangeland playas. And so the next question is a water source addition. And the best case scenario is that there is no artificial additions of water to the watershed. And the worst case is that a watershed has lands that are irrigated and the runoff goes into the playa basin. And in this particular rangeland playa case, there are no additional artificial waters going into that watershed. And then the last hydrologic factor that we want to evaluate when we're on site is a water source depletion. And best case scenario is that they're less than 10% reduction of contributing watershed of the playa from artificial diversions or structures. And worst case is that that the watershed water is reduced greater than 50%. And I had estimated that this particular playa that we looked at was about 31%. So I gave it a 0.25. Next factor is water quality factors. And this is a lot to read. I'm not going to go through it all, but the best case scenario is that there is less than 2.5 inches of sediment in the playa. And the worst case scenario is that there is greater than 24 inches of average sediment, and or there's a lot of other factors to consider too, but I'm not going to read through all of those. And I gave our benchmark condition as a 0.5 in this case. The next new factor for water quality is nutrient management. And best case scenario is that there are no artificial sources of nutrients, pesticides, or other contaminants. Of course, the worst case is that there are many of those nutrients, pesticides, and contaminants present in a level that would permanently alter the function of that playa. In this case, I gave the playa that we looked at 0.5 because it did have uncontrolled access by livestock, and there was a lot of manure in it. And the next and last factor, or no, a second to last factor, is the plant community. And this is talking about the buffers. And we're looking at whether or not the playa has a buffer in the first place and whether it supports more than 75% native plant vegetation. Worst case scenario, it supports less than 25% of native plant community. And this particular rangeland playa that we looked at, it did have some good mosaic of native plants. So I gave it a 1. So the ecology factors, this takes into consideration the buffer width. And for most rangeland playas, I would assume that the buffer is pretty much going to be the rest of the range, and it's going to be greater than 150 feet. But for most of your cropland playas, there's going to be no buffer at all, so it's going to score a 0. So then we look at the habitat suitability index scores at the end. And the limiting factor, or the lowest score, is the hydrology, and that scored a 0.38. And for programmatically speaking, for our environmental quality incentives program, our CSP conservation stewardship program, they require us to meet a criteria of 0.5 in the after score in order to meet planning criteria. So in this case, I figured that we would do that with what we were planning on filling the pit and dressing this 2-track road. So now let's take a look at this playa. And this is on the Bar Nothing Ranch. This is in Pueblo County. And this was last month that we were out there, and they had just had a good rain out there. So the playa was showing up nicely. This is probably about a 15 to 20 acre playa, and it is pitted. This is just another picture of that playa, and I guess you can probably see my cursor there. And these are pretty, as Christopher mentioned in one of his talks early this morning, is that, these playas are fairly easy to restore because you've most of the time got the fill material on site already, and you can see that berm here. So this purple line is a Huck Unit 12. So this is one of the larger hydrologic units. And the red unit here, this is the playa watershed. And it is about 243 acres. Here's another aerial photograph, or here is an aerial photograph, and it's a whole lot easier to see from an aerial photograph than it is when you're standing on the ground. But you can see where there was a pit here and also a pit here, and then some of the fill material is here and over on this side. In addition, there is a ranch road that runs north to south. Right along this blue line is a ranch road. Along this blue line is also about a 12 to 18 inch deep ditch that is actually draining about 75 acres of the Playa watershed and just dumping it off this way. So the landowner had told us when we were out there that he just doesn't see the water in this lake like he used to as a boy growing up. And when we were driving up this ranch road, we're like, oh well, maybe this is one of the reasons that this ditch is diverting a lot of the water from the watershed that would normally be contributing to the hydrology of this playa. And until you pull up some maps, and these are 5-foot intervals here on this particular map, but until you pull up a map and look at this watershed, it's hard to understand just how the water is flowing across this landscape. So again, this playa is in the planning stages right now. And this particular landowner is real interested in wildlife. However, I want to mention, like Katie mentioned, that some landowners are more interested in wildlife. Some landowners are more interested in being able to water their cattle. And so when I have worked with landowners in the past in doing restoration for rangeland playas, I work closely with all the partners, Fish and Wildlife Service, Partners Program, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Playa Lakes Joint Venture, and anybody else that will give us money, because I like to try and provide somewhere between 90 and 95% cost share to restore a playa, so that only 5 to 10% of the cost comes out of the landowner's pocket. Because a lot of the landowners are happy just the way it is with being able to water their cattle out of the pitted playa. So, in our EQIP programs, they only provide roughly about 60% of the cost to actually do the restoration. So that's a large burden on the private landowner. So another example of playa restoration that I did, this is on the Red Top Ranch. This is also in Pueblo County. And as you can see that this playa has a strange shape to it. It's rather square. It looks rather deep. You can see where the cattle are lounging on the fill that came out of the playa. They should be round in shape. This playa was pitted. Here's another photo of this pitted playa. I worked with Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service and the Rocky Mountain Bird Conservancy, which is now the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And they all pitched in addition to our EQIP program. We utilized conservation practice 657, which is wetland restoration. The unfortunate thing is that this pays by the acre and not by the cubic yard. And that's a real problem with some of our practices, because some of the largest expenses is like mobilization of a dozer just to get it on site to start moving the fill back into that pit. Just another photo of the dozer working to fill in that playa pit. during the dry season. This is after the pit was filled in and we had a nice rain. It's such a subtle gem on this landscape. It's just kind of sheet water out there. Equip covered the restoration of the playa, and then the partners covered an alternative watering source off-site. In this case, there was already a well. And so we just piped into that well through our practice 614 and put a watering source off-site so that the cattle would not be concentrated here anymore. I'm not sure if I mentioned that was a fairly large playa at about 65 acres, and that particular ranch was doing a fairly nice job with their rotational grazing system, and so we did not feel like there was any need to do any fencing of that playa. Just another photo which you have seen earlier today of the playa after a nice spring rain. Here's another playa restoration I was involved with, and this is the Leone Ranch in Otero County. Again, this playa was pitted. They also did some fancy drainage work here to help try and fill that pit. I'm not sure if they actually dug the pit where it pooled, where the playa had the water pool the most or not, but they thought that they were helping fill that so that they could water their cattle. This is about a 40-acre playa. And this one was, it doesn't look it here, but it was fairly overgrazed. Just another photo of the pitted playa. Horses and cattle standing up on the berms. Again, we use conservation practice through EQIP 657 to do wetland restoration. And I should mention here, this was brought up earlier today too, but in order to use the wetland restoration practice, the wetland does not have to meet the Food Security Act definition of a wetland, having hydric soil, hydric vegetation, and the hydrology. It just has to be functioning as a wetland and providing habitat for wildlife at some stage of their life cycle. So again, rangeland playa restoration, fairly simple. Bring a dozer in, fill the pit in. This playa as well, we provided an off-site watering source for the livestock. And I'm going to go through some of the specific practices at the end, coming up here pretty quick, in case anybody's interested in those actual practice numbers that we used. Since this playa was smaller in size and this landowner was not practicing as good as rotation as they probably could have, we asked them if they would be opposed to fencing this playa off and only flash grazing it once every 3 years. And they were okay with that. So through either partner contributions or the EQIP program, I don't remember anymore because my memory is not as good as it used to be. But we did put in this wildlife friendly fence that attached to the cross fence and fence this playa off. In addition, we used practice 644, which is wetland wildlife management and monitoring. And we actually paid this producer to monitor the vegetation within this exclosure, within this pasture, just so so that they could do adaptive management, because some years perhaps they might be able to graze after flash graze after 2 years. In other years, it may be 3 or more years. But that is another practice, 644, that we did take advantage of, where we were able to pay the landowner a small rate per acre to defer the grazing of this area, the playa, along with a buffer. And this is another playa restoration I was involved with, rangeland playa restoration. It's kind of hard to see it, but it's sitting out here to the south. Again, this playa was pitted, but not as dramatically, or maybe it became sedimented in after a while, as those 2 earlier playas that I just showed you. This playa is only about 10 acres in size. This is just a photograph of a different season, different time of year, that same playa. Again, we brought in the dozer, filled in the pit. And I don't even think we did a whole lot of packing. And I think Christopher mentioned earlier that that's not really required. I think the dozer driver did kind of drive over it a little bit to pack it, but we did not even bring in like a sheephead roller or anything like that to really pack this. And we also replaced the current fence that was there with a wildlife-friendly fence, because this was used a lot by pronghorns, and that fence that runs up alongside of that playa over here on the west side was an old, like 5-strand barbed wire fence. And so the landowner was really, really happy to have a new fence put in between his pastures, and also that it was wildlife friendly, because he was interested in hunting. So I'm going to go over some of the practices that I have used during rangeland playa restoration. These are some of the same ones that Dominic uses during cropland playa restoration, just used a little bit differently. But 314 brush management, because the playas do have water more intermittently, they often encourage Russian olive and tamarisk to grow. And so on a different playa restoration, we use 314 to initially remove and then come back and do follow-up of resprouts on the tamarisk and Russian olive. Herbaceous weed treatment. Sometimes we see whitetop and or Canada thistle coming up in these areas, and so 315 can be used to control those noxious weeds. I have never had to reseed for a rangeland playa. However, if that was needed to reseed maybe a buffer area around the playa, we would require that they put in a cover crop as a nurse crop for the native grass and forb seeding. That's 340. We also use 382 fencing to control access into playa watersheds or playa subbasins, just depending upon the size of the playa and what we can work out with the private landowner. I mentioned in that first playa, the Bar Nothing playa, that we had that terrible ditch that was running along that 2-track road and draining a lot of the watershed that should be filling the playa. We will probably be planning 410, which is grade stabilization, to help fix that ditch. This is a suite of practices that can be used to provide an off-site watering source, so that the livestock do not have to continually use the playa for watering. And once that tank is filled in, it becomes increasingly difficult for the cattle to use it. But we can use, one or whatever we need out of this suite of different practices, whether we need to drill a new water well, put in a solar pumping plant, run a livestock pipeline to a water facility. But again, these are all practices that are used for rangeland playa restoration, and I guess in some cases maybe used for cropland playa restoration. Rangeland planting, this is 550 that would be used after we would establish the cover crop if needed. Again, I have never had to use that. It just seems like if you restore it, those plants do come back with the moisture. 560 is an engineering practice for access roads. And this is another practice that we will be planning to actually move that road, that 2-track road that was cutting off part of the playa watershed at the Bar Nothing Ranch. And then we have several other practices. These are more management practices. 643, restoration of rare or declining natural communities. 644, wetland wildlife habitat management, or 645, upland wildlife habitat management. These can all be used for filling the pit in a rangeland playa. Again, they are paid by the acre, so they don't sometimes come close to covering, what it takes for the restoration. These practices can also be used for paying a landowner to monitor on these acres if they are deferring the grazing, or we can actually use them to pay for deferring grazing on a playa if needed. And then the last one, which is the one that we used most, which is 657, playa restoration, or excuse me, wetland restoration. And again, this one pays on a per acre basis. I was looking at some other practices yesterday, and they're more often like precision landforming and smoothing. Those pay both on a per acre basis or a cubic yard basis. And I know Dominic uses those for cropland restoration. And I think there would be a way that if we look at the purpose and look at where the practice can be used, that we might be able to use that practice for 62 and it might be a better match as far as payment for doing the actual restoration. And I guess I would just say that, pick the scenario if you're working with NRCS, or if you work for NRCS, pick a scenario along with the payment that would most closely equal about 60% of the cost of the work. Because there are, different practices that can be used to do the same thing. And it's not always clear cut. And if you have any questions, you can contact myself or Katie for more direction on what practice would be best to use for playa restoration. And this is my last slide, and Christopher showed this morning. This is an excellent publication that is on the Playa Lakes joint venture, and this is a hot link to it that you can get this. And again, playa restoration on rangeland especially is fairly easy. And this is a 6-page restoration guide that you all should have for your resources. Any questions?
Thank you, Patty, and thank you, Dominic, for walking us through restoration. There's been a good discussion in the chat around the cost of restoration. And Dominic, I think there was a direct question in there for you. Do you have an average cost on WRE Playas in Kansas in the last 5 years? But any other questions for Dominic or Patty?
So for the average cost, that varies so much depending upon dirt work. The seeding mix that we use typically runs around $180 to $200 an acre to seed for the range planting. You'll have around $55, $60, as much as $70 an acre for cover crop. Dirt work is usually to remove sediment is going to run around $4 to $450 an acre for sediment removal. So, and then terrace smoothing is going to be somewhere around that 50 cents a foot for leveling of terraces and smoothing of terraces. So it really depends on how much dirt work we need, and how big the upland buffer area is compared to the amount of dirt work that we're doing. So it varies widely. The WRE program, a permanent easement, one thing I will say, if it's a permanent easement, NRCS covers 100 up to 100% of the actual maximum for restoration. So basically, there is no cost to the landowner on a permanent WRE easement. That's all covered by NRCS. Abe, you have a question?
I do. And this is more geared towards Patty. I got several questions here. So you referred to haying on Playa Lakes. How often does that happen in Colorado on rangeland?
About once every 10 years.
Okay, so not very often.
Not very often, no, but it does
But-
happen.
Okay, and I was going to ask how, I mean, to me, just haying pliers is in my mind just is a hard thing to do, because if you do get rain at the right time and you do get some forage out there, a lot of that is annual weeds, and it just is hard for me to wrap my head around why someone would be risking to bury a swather in a playa just to get out so little vegetation, unless they're in that dire need of forage. Just kind of
I would agree, Abe, but I have seen playa lakes that have been hayed.
okay. Yeah, that's not a thing out here in Western Kansas, but we have had people ask about it, and I just was curious how that worked. The other thing, in your presentation, you had trees in the background. Would you mind describing what types of trees you're removing on the landscape? Whether that, I know that Dominic said something about red cedar, but are you dealing with more like salt cedar and or Russian olive and or Jap elm?
Yes, I mentioned that. Did it not come through? So yes, when I have done playa restoration, we had to deal with Russian olive and tamarisk, and that's what we're using the 314, the brush management for.
Gotcha. And then the last question I have on practice 560, the road practice that you were talking about.
Yes.
Does that include culverts?
I'm not sure. I would have to ask an engineer. I have not personally used that. However, after going out to the Bar Nothing Ranch, and I was talking to one of our civil engineering technicians, and I said, hey, we've got this playa, and a lot of the water is being diverted because there's this ditch that's running along this 2-track, and it's probably been like this for years. And I said, would you use practice 410 to, grade grade stabilization structures to address that, or what would you use? And he was the one that said that he's like, well, I would move the road. And he's like, that would be 560. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, and I do not honestly know if it would include culvert.
Gotcha. And Patty and Dominic, correct me if I'm wrong here. That 560 can't be used on county roads at all, correct? It would just have to be on private 2 tracks or private roads.
Private roads would have to, for an NRCS, it would have to be private roads.
Yeah, we don't even do culverts for like EWP, the emergency watershed protection on county or state highways. So it's all private.
Gotcha. Well, I will say, at least here in Kansas, we've had success working with the county roads department of connecting playas if there are some watershed opportunities to connect them. So just throwing it out there. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Abe, can I comment on your haying?
Yeah.
We actually do some haying in western Kansas, and it's a little bit different than eastern Colorado. We use it as a management practice. So if we cannot get a producer to do prescribed fire and burn when we need to, haying is an option. And typically how we've handled it in western Kansas is when we come up to the fact that it needs to have some older vegetation removed, we usually hay that in thirds. So we'll write a compatible use agreement, which allows the landowner to actually do activity on a wetland reserve easement. And how we typically will do it is do a third of the easement every year for 3 years. And then at the end of 3 years, we'll come back and reevaluate it and make sure that we have obtained our goals and objectives of that management.
Gotcha. Yeah, I understand that, Dominic, and I've seen that done before, but I think maybe I was confused with Patty's comment, but this was on range or pasture ground that they're haying. Maybe that's where my confusion started.
Sorry, I missed that part. Sorry.
Yeah, so Patty, am I off base there that this is the area that you're talking about haying is on pasture, or is this like previous
It's not
crop
pasture,
land?
it's on rangeland.
Okay. So it is rangeland.
It
Okay.
is rangeland. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep, we consider pasture as usually irrigated. And I guess they're used interchangeably, range or pasture, but yeah, no, this is on rangeland that I have seen people haying their playa lakes in Colorado.
Interesting. Totally different world. It's crazy. And we're like just a few hundred miles away. So cool. Well, thank you, Patty. Thank you, Dominic.
Other questions? We've got about 10 minutes left for questions and discussion. Yes, Brian, I saw you unmuted.
I did. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Well, first, this has been a great workshop today. I want to thank all the presenters and everybody that's been involved. And as we're getting toward the end of the session today, I just kind of have a higher level question in terms of how to effectively build playa conservation programs. Speaking from my experience here in Colorado, there's been various initiatives over the years that have had some degree of success. But recently, we've all been talking about the need, the recognition that we need to do more and do better. And it's been great to hear from our partners in surrounding states today, but yet we haven't heard from all states. And I know some of you on the call, like Christopher with the joint venture, work with programs in other states like Texas, New Mexico. But I guess I'm going to pose a very broad question for you all that have experience in other states. If you were to start over and build a program, are there slam dunk partnerships and or funding programs that you would say be sure to utilize, don't miss them? And then are there others that you would say maybe don't waste your time with these? I thought it might be useful to hear just a frank conversation about that. I was wondering from Abe's remarks, for example, like, is CP 23A a waste of time or not? And it sounds like CP 38B is a slam dunk. So those kind of things I think would be very helpful for us to hear in the last few minutes of the workshop today as we all continue talking here in Colorado and trying to build more effective programs for playa conservation. Thanks.
Abe,
And
Abe, you take it. Great question, Brian. Thank you.
yeah,
Abe.
thank you, Brian. And yeah, so slam dunks, as we all work across different landscapes and different regions, we all know what practices and programs work for our constituents and or our producers. So I would venture to ask your colleagues and your partners within the state of Colorado, what has worked best thus far and how can you make it better? Because that's what PLJV did. And Christopher, if you're still on, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's what we did for 38B. We went out and talked to our producers in Kansas and Nebraska to develop the CP38B model. And also too, with our WRE model, our WRE model and CP38B model, one is administered by FSA, the other one's administered by NRCS, but they are very, very, very good programs for producers who have playa lakes on the landscape. It might be a little different in Colorado for those who are more into rangeland, and they might be more interested in CSP and or EQIP. We don't get a lot of EQIP or CSP interest when it comes to playa lake conservation and or restoration. Those other two programs I previously stated, the 38B and WRE here in Kansas, are just better programs for our producers. I don't know how it would be an effect for Colorado, but if you're able to build your own program, I would say dream big and dream in the ways that the landowner could use it for the next 15 or 30 years. That'd be my suggestion. And when it comes to funding sources, I don't know if John Denton's on or not, but or Catherine, I don't know what their budget is like in Colorado, but the interest in this region is a to put it really, really frankly, it's a high interest area for national food security, and water is part of food security in this region. So there's a lot of larger larger companies that are willing to stick their neck out and help out this area when it comes to extra funding. John, you have anything to say there?
Oh, and Brian's pretty aware that our funding in that part of the state is not great yet. That's probably why I asked that question. We're trying to figure that
I'm
out.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but no, that's what we're. I mean, I think there's opportunities, but I recently put in an ARCA grant. It did not make the cut. So needing match more than anything to have funding from our perspective from different funding sources like NACA. But I mean, there are avenues via NRCS and FSA that we haven't pursued yet. We don't really, as you know, you're kind of our staff member down that direction at the moment. So we're kind of relying on you a little bit until we get going.
I see Ted, you have a hand up.
Yeah, good. First off, great discussion's been going on here, and and good question, Brian. The biggest concern I have, or the thing I struggle with on our playas, especially in the western part of the state, where we're semi-arid and they're small, very similar to Kansas and Colorado, is that when they get put into some of the USDA programs, this isn't a criticism, it's the rules they deal with. But getting adequate management on those is a real challenge because CRP doesn't allow regular grazing, haying, some of those things. And at least in Nebraska, especially the central part, we deal with a lot of invasives. I mentioned earlier, reed canary and lots of tree encroachment. And we've seen cases where those playas get set aside and they just grow up to reed canary grass and trees, and they lose all their value from a wildlife standpoint for the type of wildlife we're targeting. So I think if you were going to start a program from scratch, it would be one that would allow a lot of latitude for agricultural use. These playas are really dynamic, really resilient. They've proven to be, but figure out how do you get the sediment out? How do you keep it out, but still allow disturbance? And ideally, you would transition some of those just to rangeland. But again, some of those really small footprints, it's challenging to get that transition to a size that a rancher could use. But there are cases when that's a possibility too. So just my thoughts on that.
And this is Christopher Roustet with the Playa Lakes Joint Venture. And answer to your question, Brian, and from my standpoint, I don't think there is a slam dunk that works everywhere. And the reason for that is that every state has different funding options and different funding opportunities that can be accessed. Sometimes very, very different. NRCS and FSA is big into playa conservation in Kansas, and to some bigger, to a perhaps lesser extent in Nebraska, but it doesn't work, or it has not yet been working well in Oklahoma or and Texas, and not at all really in New Mexico, from my standpoint. So looking at what agencies are there and looking at the issues and how willing they are to work with other partners is one of the reasons that you can't get a practice that's a slam dunk. On the other end, however, is landowner attitudes and culture. And there's different cultures all across our region, from Nebraska down to Texas and Oklahoma over to Colorado. So you have very different understandings of what is needed on the land, very different cultures there. And I think Abe's comment about asking the producers what will work for them, and then ensuring that partners who are looking at playa conservation are also at the table at the same time is perhaps the best way to go about it. I think it is one of the reasons that Kansas is now going great guns, is because that work has been done, and not so much in other states, from my perspective.
Thank you, Christopher. And I'm going to cut us off. I want to be respectful of everybody's time this Friday afternoon, but thank you everybody for spending the day with us on this workshop. We hope it was useful, and another huge thank you to all of our facilitators. I've got everybody's email from the RSVP, so expect an email from me next week with the recording and some of the resources that were shared in the chat today. And of course, hopefully you all have my email, so reach out directly if you didn't get something or you have a follow-up question for one of the facilitators. I also plan on making PDFs of all the facilitator presentations and including that with the email as well. So with that, everybody have a great rest of your Friday and a good weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.